Okay, thanks, Will. I'd like to call to order the December 20th ACSD board meeting. At this time, I would like to ask the board members in the room to introduce themselves, then we'll do board members online, then we'll do staff in the room. Mary.
I'm Mary Gill.
Mary, available?
Jim Bowman. Lindsay Hescott.
Amy McClatchy.
Peter Burrow, Superintendent.
Mary Coney.
Peter Coleman.
Jen Newcedar.
Henry Carpenter, Student Representative.
Barbara Wilson.
Logan Price, Business Manager.
Will Hatch, Technology Director.
Suzanne.
Suzanne Buck.
Betty.
Betty Kafumbe.
That's all online.
Well,
Just for board members. Yeah, that's it. Great. Can we have staff in the room introduce themselves?
Caitlin Steele, Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning. Nicole Carter, Director, Equity and Student Services.
Bruce McIntyre, Director of Facilities.
Mike Dudek, Principal at Homes.
Karen Stanford, Assistant Principal at Homes.
Andrew Forty, Assistant Principal at Homes.
Heather Ross, Principal at Cornwall. Kathy Keenan, High School Assistant Principal. Gail Woodall, Assistant Principal at Mary Logan. Frank Kravitz, Principal at Mary Logan. Tracy Harrington, Principal at Earthdale.
Justin Campbell, High School Principal.
Great. And Will, could you read for us? Oh, and Lorraine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Lorraine Morris, Middlebury.
Thank you. And then Will, if you could read for us who's online.
Yes, we have Chelsea Giuliani, Joanna Doria, MCTV, Bruce Bernstein, and Johnny Scuteri.
Great. And also let the record show that Victoria Jetty is also present. So with that, as always, we would like to provide the opportunity for public comment. There has been a couple of questions with regards to the submission of public comments. So public comments the individual needs to be present and read. If we started reading all public comments that got sent via an email and we got 1,000 public comments, it's just not a precedent that we can maintain. If I do get one, I will send it to the entire board and then also send it so that it is recorded in minutes, but we will not be reading them out loud. So with that, if you do have a public comment that you would like to make, please raise your hand. We ask that you out and state your name so that that can be entered into the record as well. If you're online and you have a public comment, just raise your Zoom hand.
Johnny Scuteri.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to mention quick that at last week's board meeting, I had made a public comment, but it is not reflected in the minutes. I do have that written out and I could send it if that's helpful. Just let me know. Sorry, I just ran in the door from getting home. And then on tonight's agenda, I just wanted to speak quickly about the action item for the State Board of Education position. And I would just ask that you reconsider your stance on not being willing to negotiate or compromise, especially regarding the town vote, which community members have made very clear is something that they would like to see amended in the charter. I know you've gone over that you're going to state reasons for closure, and those will be shared with the towns and with the communities. But I hope that you can look at it from our perspective and see that the criteria laid out for what a model elementary school looks like precludes any of our small schools from qualifying. So as you go through the bullet points, full staffing of all positions, including nurses and specials and music, and no multi-age classrooms and dedicated, maker spaces, all of the criteria just remove any of our small schools from qualifying. And so that's what concerns a lot of us, is that it seems like the groundwork is being laid to not only close some of our small schools, but I really believe, based on the information I have, that it's being laid to close all of our small schools and potentially have a 2-school model, which I know is still being was being considered as of September of last year. So I hope that there can be some discussion. I know last week's meeting was so jam-packed that there wasn't a lot of room for discussion, but I hope that you can reconsider and listen to the community. And you know, we've asked time and time again to include that town vote among other things. So I hope you'll consider, and I'll close with that. And I want to wish you all a very happy and healthy holiday, and thank you for the time and effort you put into serving. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other Zoom hands? Great, thank you all very much. At this time, we'd like a motion to approve the minutes of December 13th.
I'll move that we approve the minutes of December 13th.
May I have a second? Chip? Great. Any questions, comments, or discussion?
I'll state again, Mary, that I like these minutes. I've been an advocate of, and this was especially good, I thought, since we had many comments, and I liked how they were presented. Put them into the person counts. I thought this read so much better, and I understood the meeting better, even though I was there.
Thank you. Mary Heather?
I would just suggest maybe we check the recording to note Tanya Scuteri's public comments.
Great, and I can, yeah. Any other comments on the minutes? Great, so pending confirmation of the Tanya Scuteri comment, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, so moved. ACSD bills.
There were bills read today. I read them. Victoria read them. Thank you. There were three warrants. The first one is for the general fund. There was a total of $1,348,353.14. We'll comment that more than half of this number is this about $702,000, which is a check paid to the Hannaford Career Center for our assessment, which I presume is paid twice a year. Is that right? I don't know, but anyway, that of that 1.3 mil, half of it is assessment to Hannaford. Second one is a payroll warrant for net pay of $851,079.35. Third warrant is for net pay of $411.35. I move that we pay these bills.
Second. Any questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? So moved. Next on the docket is report of the superintendent. Peter, you're up.
Great. So this is our second conversation on the budget tonight, and we'll be going through a first draft. We're still kind of continuing to work on some of the final pieces, so we expect that most of this will stay fairly static. A few slight changes probably will be made, nothing significant as we go from this meeting to our next budget meeting on the 3rd, and then we're hoping to, on the 10th, have something final to bring to the board. As we know from past years, sometimes that works out really well and we have something on the 10th and everyone feels great. Sometimes we need to spend a little bit more time. There have been some years where we've added an additional meeting to kind of figure out some fees that may have been thrown in at the last minute. This year is not seeming that way. So thus far, in terms of like the budget climate, what's happening in the state, things feel, I think, relatively stable on that front. Before Logan jumps into the budget, it would be great for Chip to share a little bit as the Finance Committee Chair regarding our conversations with him and with the board regarding this budget. Chip?
Well, as budgets get developed, it is sort of a process which starts generally, focuses down. We heard from the principals the other night about potential staff changes or whatever. And it's relatively complicated when you look at it in all its pieces. From the board's perspective, the Finance Committee, which is myself, Victoria, and Barb, met a couple times with Logan and Peter to sort of look at the preliminary parts and what Logan will present tonight relative to the sort of environment we're in, some of the big changes which are happening this year, albeit there is no threshold that we are having to meet one way or another. That doesn't mean it's open game, but it means it's a different environment. The healthcare costs are still extremely high. Doesn't look like they're going to go down, at least in our board times, probably, but in any case, that's a problem. Inflation right now in the country is an issue. No one knows exactly where that's going to go. It's hard to build that in. We do have our both contracts signed and sealed, which is very, very helpful. At least it gives you an absolute baseline that you can use to figure out what your labor costs are going to be. Especially since, salaries and benefits make up more than 3/4 of the entire budget. So I think the process at this point has gone okay. We just got just today, I guess, the equalized pupil numbers, which does then figure into what our costs per student are going to be. We did lose students again, which is significant in how it comes out with budget per student. But I think the process has gone okay. There's some good parts to it for sure. There's major challenges always, and this is always going to be what we want and what we need. And as anybody's private finances, it's no different. There's always a clash in the middle, and you have to decide one way or another. I will say one other thing that we've heard a lot relative to some changes, especially in discipline and school environments, which is not just here, it's all over the country. But in trying to address that, it's not just putting people on people, but it's finding systems and finding people to work those systems in different ways. And so that's administration's job to come up with that, to try to help alleviate, break, whatever else we have to do to solve or ameliorate this problem. So turn it over to Logan.
And after I go, we're going to segue into a presentation from Bruce. So what we were going to do initially is a presentation on ESSER, the Emergency Relief Funds, and what that story looks like. So stop me if I'm missing anything.
Let me just
or,
talk just briefly about that. So Caitlin has been really kind of taking the lead on ESSER throughout the last year or so, year and a half, and figuring out how we're going to use these funds, and they've come in 3 different segments. So the fund has changed over time. When we look at the budget later on, the importance of seeing this first is some of the revenue on the overview of the budget for this year will show ESSER funds. And we talked to the last meeting, and we talked about this in relation to moms and how we were approaching the budget at moms, which is a little bit different than how we're approaching anywhere else, because we're kind of giving ourselves some space to design and develop with the staff as we go into next year. And part of how we're able to do that is through ESSER funds. So we have been over the last year or so, and as we look ahead to next year, we are looking at how we're using those ESSER funds to support kind of immediate one-time needs, transitional needs. We are talking a lot about how those ESSER funds are great until they're gone. And that's something that we have to be thinking about and talking about. We don't want to develop an over-reliance on $3 million and then be short $3 million. So that is something that we are thinking about in terms of the systems and design process. Caitlin?
So in a handful of slides, I hope to give you a pretty high-level overview of what ESSER is and how we're conceptualizing it. You could dig deeper into these slides. They link to other sources, and I can share the link with anybody who wants to go deeper.
But basically, the SR funds, they became available to us last year or earlier this year, 2021, and the last of them will expire in 2024. So we've got a couple more school years where we can still be drawing from these. They come out of 3 different buckets, 3 different federal acts. So SR1 came from the CARES Act, SR2 from the CRRSA Act, and then the ARP SR and ARP IDEA are from the American Rescue Plan Act. They rolled out in that order over time during the pandemic. So basically, they focus on COVID relief and on allowing us to keep our elementary and secondary schools open and respond to emerging needs. These are formula grants. They're allocated to us in proportion to our Title I funds. So what that means is that we get told how much money we will have access to, and we write our grant investments within those limits. We aren't obligated to draw all of that money, but it would seem silly to leave it on the table. So the allowable uses are incredibly broad, and I'm not going to read all of this to you, but it's everything from buying cleaning supplies to renovating buildings to funding positions, new or existing. I mean, you can do a lot of different things with these grants. And that there's a little link at the bottom there that shows some of the source material for these simplified bullet points that I've pulled here. ARP IDEA is, as opposed to the 3 SRs, SR1, SR2, and ARP SR, basically align with this bullet list. And then ARP IDEA is the piece of the ARPA Act that relates to special education. So it has different allowable uses, broadly defined as school reentry, disruption in the education of children with disabilities, mental health services, and equity in special education and early intervention services. It's a much smaller grant, and it's just conceptualized a little bit differently. Maybe I got it on there. No, that's great. So I like this table because it sort of shows you at a glance what these grants are and what they do for us. So they total about $5.4 million. So the little one was SR1 at $403,000 in change. The red check means we have met that deadline. We applied. We are spending that money now. And I'll show you in a few slides what we've done with that. We will need to reconcile our budgets and understand where we have underspent on that to understand what can be reallocated, but largely that one's taken care of. SR2 is about $1.5 million. We've got about $100,000 in a position that we wrote and posted and never filled that we'll need to reallocate those funds. But you can see that we have until July of 2023 to make our final amendment on that. So these are really quite flexible grant funds that we can continue to revise over time. ARP IDEA is the $136,000, and that's our special education one. So that's all allocated. We'll show you what we did with it. But you can see ARP ESSER at $3.3 million. That's the big one. That's still very much on the table. We don't have access to that yet, and I'll show you at the end of this what hoops we need to jump through to tap into that money. And you can also see on the obligation deadline that that's the last one to expire, so September of 2024. So my understanding is that basically for positions that we're funding, that gives us 2 more school years that we might fund positions into. So the AOE encourages us to break, that says SR2, it should say all of them, all of our SR funds with other local and federal and grant dollars that we have, and to align our spending with statewide recovery priorities. So last spring, they published those as socio-emotional functioning, mental health and well-being, student engagement and truancy, academic achievement and success. You might remember that we wrote a plan based on those 3 bullets last spring, and this fall they added safe and healthy operations as a 4th pillar to focus on. So our SR1 investments, I think we've talked to you about these. We hired a SEL coordinator for the district. We hired a literacy coordinator for the district. We hired a half-time preschool and early childhood transitions coordinator. A social worker, I think she's called a prevention specialist. She's working at Shoreham. That one was open for a while, but we did get it filled, and it's an important position in that school this year. And an elementary literacy interventionist currently serving Ripton and Weybridge schools, which were the two elementary schools who didn't already have literacy interventionists. So when we're trying to get equitable staffing, we were filling a gap with that. So those, that pretty much uses SR1 for us. Last spring, we had to write a COVID recovery plan for the Agency of Education, and I believe that I think that we brought it to you for approval, and this is just showing you in bold what we focused on. So remember, I don't know if any of us remember, last spring we thought maybe we were coming out of this pandemic thing, and we were writing our recovery plan. And our recovery plan would be focusing on literacy and math and data-driven decision-making and IB for all, and getting systems in place to support success for all students. So we had this big vision, including SEL and math and literacy and equity. And we wrote it into a plan, which we submitted in the spring and got approved. And we used that plan to inform how we applied for SR2 funds. So SR2 funds, this is the bullet points of how we are currently spending or budgeting those SR2 funds. So you can see a second year of that SEL coordinator. So year one is right now. This is next year's funding for that SEL coordinator. Next year's funding for that literacy coordinator. Next year's funding for the pre-K coordinator and the social worker and the literacy interventionist. This year we added 2 behavior interventionists at MUMS. They're hired and funded with SR2, a general educator and a special educator. And we plan on carrying those positions into next year. This is what Peter was talking about, the flexibility that we're creating to make sure that we support MUMS in sort of sticking the landing in a challenging year. We have compensation for our nurses, who I'm sure you know are working beyond their normal contract obligations to just keep us all safe and well through COVID. So they have MOUs to be paid for that extra time. We had some budget for after school and summer programming, supplemental literacy instruction. We partnered with the Stern Center to provide that during the summer and a little bit through this school year. We have an investment for a diversity, equity, and inclusion audit, including strategic planning and professional development. And we've done a big investment in literacy, professional development, and a major audit of our early literacy materials and supplies across buildings. And the order is in, and like so many other things, it's a bit back ordered, so we're waiting. But when that is fulfilled, we'll have really equitable access to those core learning resources across all of our elementary schools. And we have a grant investment designed for multiple professional development opportunities in positive behavior intervention, restorative practices, including a train-the-trainer model. So we're trying to train a team of people within our school community to be teachers of these practices so that we're building capacity over time. So that's SR2. With our IDA, the basic is 127,000 and change. We've used that to fund secondary special education coordination. We reallocated our secondary special education coordinator to be an awesome assistant principal at MUMS. We've needed to fill that gap in district leadership. Recovering occupational and physical therapy supports, focusing on regulation through sensory stimulation and movement. Recovering speech and language supports. We would joyfully hire a speech language pathologist if you know anybody, but currently we're using presence learning to fill a gap. And then for the IDA pre-K basic, about $9,000 is similar to that OTPT investment up above. Did I miss anything? Oh, that was perfect. Actually, we're looking for 2 SLPs. 2 SLPs.
Tell your friends.
So those are 3 of the grants, and now we have the big one. This is the one that's still very much on the table. There are some specific requirements. We have to reserve at least 20% of this $3.3 million to address learning loss using evidence-based interventions. And we have to develop and make publicly available a plan for a safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services. That's it. Most Vermont schools had done that in the fall of 2020. So we've done what we need to do to check that box. There's another plan that we need to write though, which isn't exactly what that bullet is referencing. So we have to complete a public plan for ARP ESSER spending, including a requirement at the federal level for pretty extensive stakeholder engagement, making sure that we're engaging stakeholders who represent Native American populations, civil rights groups, association members, students with disabilities, students in foster care. We really need to engage a wide range of stakeholders. At this point, we've gotten as far, we've done a lot of stakeholder engagement, but we haven't checked all of the boxes. And so we've drafted a survey. If we're really going to reach our English learners and our migrant population, we need to get that translated and make it readily available. So we're sort of puzzling through how we'll do that stakeholder engagement in a way that's both efficient and meaningful. We need to do that and then draft our plan and put that out for public comment before we can submit it to the AOE and before we can really access this $3.3 million in ARP ESSER funds. Logan and I have been co-leading on ESSER for quite some time, and we've been keeping a messy list of the ideas that come to us. And so we have a pretty long wish list. I promise we can think of more than $3.3 million worth of things we would love to do. They include things like HVAC updates, windows and doors, continuing some of these positions, understanding how to sunset them over time, but then also thinking about those stakeholders who we haven't yet engaged yet, knowing that more ideas will surface and we're going to need to make some tough decisions about how we spend that money. That's all I've got.
Do we do questions before? All right, Heather.
Can you just remind me of the timeline for that and how much time is available for public engagement and when that needs to be done by before?
So, I think, Logan, you've made it to more of the Wednesday morning meeting things than I have recently. I don't think they've given us an official deadline for the ARP ESSER plan yet, right?
No, it has to be submitted for review before they'll approve concepts that we want to spend the money on, but
before that can be submitted, we need to have it engaged in public comment.
right, the plan's not complete, and we can't get the step of approval on it until we either have done the public comment and stakeholder engagement, or at least have a plan for when we're going to do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The plan, as the template, as the AOE has provided us, allows for us to tell when we will do stakeholder engagement on the plan that we submit. So it can be written in the future tense. However, one of the big constraints about that's an interesting detail, yes. One of the constraints with timing is that there are a lot of approval steps that we need to go through for any construction we would want to use to do with this. And we've talked to Bruce. Logan and I have had a couple of meetings with Bruce and really thought about it. He's going to need to be submitting concepts for approval by February, probably, just to get it, to have a chance of spending it by September of 2024. So that's why I said we want to be both efficient and meaningful in our stakeholder engagement. We are a little bit nervous about running up against timing limits on spending the money.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Mary?
I have a question about the stakeholders, and I may have missed some of them, but is there somebody who's going to be representing young families stressed because of low income, single parent home? Is there a stakeholder group for that group? I mean, I know we've got Native Americans, we've got non-English speakers, but there's a significant population in our county that represents the stressed young families that do not have money.
So I know stressed young families language isn't in there. However, I'm trying to picture the list of stakeholders and think about, I don't remember seeing free and reduced price lunch eligibility, but that would be a typical indicator that would, and we can add those indicators. The way that we've constructed it currently is a survey where they can check, like, these things describe me. And the idea with that is that then at a minimum, we can say, well, who haven't we reached yet? As a very basic first stab at making sure that we have broad representation. So many of our traditional stakeholder groups are already represented in our recovery planning team, which has been working since spring of 2020 and still continues to meet monthly. So we have our association represented and our special educators and our classroom teachers and our administrators and our facilities and our technology. So we have broad representation on that, but it doesn't hit all of those traditionally marginalized populations because that's not well represented on our faculty and staff.
On one of the slides in which you identified the positions that had been added for general educator and I believe special educator in months, a lot of this content I could argue, yes, hopefully the nurses don't have to be spending as much time dealing with COVID after we've gotten through this now. But for those two positions, how are we thinking about post-funding? Specifically for those two positions? Or you seem like finite?
I mean, I think a lot of this is going to be clear once the kind of the next iteration of the model is developed. So as we're talking about saving these positions, we're saving space for the conversation to determine what are the positions that are needed. So it's not necessarily, we're not thinking these two exact positions will live in perpetuity. We're essentially have space within the ESSER funds to be able to be flexible around, again, adding transitional positions or some positions that we then may need to build into the general local ed spending in FY24 or 25 or whenever that is.
So if I understand that correctly, Logan and the team is going to identify and say, great, of these investments that we've made, we see $450,000 worth of investments that we want to take beyond 2024. And we're going to build whatever that number is, an assumption into that budget creation that we want to pull those things forward.
The issue is going to be, I don't think it's going to be, we're not going to take, if you look at those listed positions and potential positions that could come out of our ESSER and say, okay, we're going to take 1/3 of those positions and keep them. We don't yet know if our budget can support those additional positions. So there are really significant systems questions that we have to answer and design for, both coming out of this ESSER windfall and also understanding what the budget climate will be probably at this time next year and definitely at this time in 2 years when I believe, and Peter can speak to this, the legislature will have gone through the weighting study and had made decisions around that. And we're kind of clear in terms of what the suppression is on our ed spending to know how that's going to impact both our approach to these numbers and the community's support of them.
Yeah, I guess I would just encourage some type of risk factor analysis saying we recognize that this budget, that these investments have a weighted risk factor of whatever that number is, because we know that there is the propensity we're going to need to continue on with this type of funding. Right? Like going into that eyes wide open is going to be important as just as we're having the conversation so we can plan. We don't get to 2024 and we're like, oh my gosh, whoa.
Well, and one of our challenges right now is the need is so great.
Totally.
That
yeah, and that's why I would
add like a baseline that feels like.
No, I get it, and that's why I wouldn't, like, it's one of those things where from a leadership perspective, you have to say, yes, this is a priority, we need to do it, and we're not going to not do it because it might have long-lasting effect. We have to do it. That being said, we also need to go into it eyes wide open that we are doing it, and what does that number look like? Peter.
Thanks. First of all, really good presentation, really itemizing where this money's going, and I really applaud the efforts going towards literacy. In the 20% that has to be reserved within our ESSER, can that 20% go toward the current efforts underway that are sort of addressing those, like literacy, like SEL? In other words, in a sense, provide yet another year of funding for that work.
Oh, continue. So we've done some really great, I'm so excited about some of the early literacy work that we've done. Heather Gibo is the literacy coordinator we hired out of the ranks at Mary Hogan, and she's just taken the lead in such a thoughtful way. So I feel really excited about much of the work that she's done in terms of building capacity. And then we've really shored up, assessed, what is the baseline for making sure that all teachers have the same baseline level of foundational literacy training and everybody has access to the same materials. And then there would be several steps we could take after that if we continue this funding. So could we do that?
Well, yeah, my question really is about that 20% that has to be devoted toward, some of those efforts. And I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be new.
It doesn't have to be new.
No.
So I guess what I'm not understanding is, are you asking, can we continue those efforts with new money, or can we move that from SR2, which didn't have this constraint, into our SR to check off some of that 20%?
Sure.
I don't know the answer to that one. That's an interesting question. The SR1 and SR2 didn't have the same constraints on them. They were far more flexible. And I mean, we've got way more of these HVAC and windows and doors projects that we would love to do if we could free up all of that money. I guess I don't actually know the details of that one. I'll look into it. Yeah.
Barb? Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, recovery is a long road. I agree 100% with what Mary was saying. Have you looked at how, maybe over the summer, we didn't really have a lot of time last year to have a lot of summer programs, but can we use some of these monies to, really have, better summer programs to really help some of our kiddos in a nice, hopefully summer kind of environment catch up a little bit?
It is absolutely an allowable use. Well, we hit last year was we didn't have leadership. We didn't have leadership capacity to do the work in a robust way. So just from this single perspective, I would say if we want to do summer programming, we would need to invest in leadership for that. We would need to hire a person to design. And that's an interesting fiscal cliff challenge. If we design something with grant that relies on grant funding for leadership, and it's beautiful and families love it, and then we need to cut it in 2 years or fund it another way in 2 years, I think that's one that would really need a significant sustainability plan going in. It's certainly a thing people are hungry for. And yes, we can use these dollars to do that.
I'm just like looking at, just my limited exposure so far, it's just such a big problem.
And after school.
Yeah.
Summer and after school.
Yeah, exactly.
Chip and then Lindsay.
Just a quick question as to how this is reflected in the budget book eventually. Are these positions that we're talking about, will they be footnoted that they're ESSER funded? I mean, obviously the money comes in as revenue because it's a grant, but I just want to know how we're going to define it in the written part that all of us look at and the public looks at to decide. So what is this budget? Because the budget's not bigger by $3 million or whatever. So I guess you have a.
Yeah, it won't reside under the local ed spending. So we'll have a separate section where we have grant funded positions and grant funded information to show, ESSER in terms of for this next fiscal year, basically how much ESSER funding and some of what you saw just now is included within this budget. But yeah, we'll make sure that there's not a.
Because that's really important.
Yeah, and we do that every year.
This hasn't happened before. We haven't had somebody say, hey, here's $3 million, figure out how to deal with it. And it just doesn't happen. Of course, it's complicated, but it's still confusing.
Well, we've had that traditionally with our, our title funding, for example. So we have kept that up. This number, like you said, is a lot bigger, and definitely want to show folks, because there have been a lot of questions around, how are you spending it? What's the impact? So information in the budget book will be really helpful.
Lindsay?
One of the things I wanted to say relates to this. It would be really helpful to understand how the ESSER funds impact the budget. I'm looking at one of the documents in our, the packet that we got. I'm looking at the financial section draft as of 12/17/21 year budget summary. And it actually shows ESSER funds going down by 107.7%. And then it also shows universal pre-K going down. And can we use those funds for universal pre-K? Granted, there might be a sustainability issue, but that's going down by 16.9%. And so I'm not fully seeing the connection between our budget and the impact of the ESSER funds on the budget. It seems like in fiscal year 23, the ESSER fund revenue would be going up. And would that be expenditures? I want to echo what Barb said about after-school programs, summer programs, and pre-K programs that could be really amazing, but then the sustainability of those programs. I mean, would it be better to have it for 2 years and then just drop off? I don't,
Yeah, I think that the dream would be to have somebody with a couple of years to build a thing that could be sustainable.
That would be so wonderful.
It's a big task. It's not impossible, but it would be ideal. I can't answer your specific questions, but I saw Logan give me an eye that he might be able to.
Yeah, so the reason FY23 is roughly half of FY22 is the entire SR1 pot, the entire 400,000 was budgeted for FY22. As the entire SR2 pot of 1.5 million was budgeted approximately half FY22, half FY23. The big number, the 3.3 million for SR3 hasn't been decided on yet, and so doesn't appear in this budget yet.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, so it's all of SR1 and half of SR2 roughly. Current year, FY22, the other half of SR2 next year, so it looks like a big drop.
And do we expect the third pot to be spent in 23 and 24 or just 24?
No, both.
Both, okay, so this really is just a draft until we know more about that
It's
third.
because our allocation, it's because the SR3 decisions haven't been made yet of when we're gonna spend that money and which year. So it's just not part of the story at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And just to clarify too, the ESSER funding, when we go in front of the community with a budget, we're not asking them, we don't have to have the ESSER information finished yet because the community is voting on local ed spending, not on our grant funding, which comes from the
Grant.
So,
Peter and then Jen. Peter and Jen.
So I, knowing about the ESSER funds and when we were originally talking about it, knowing it was this one-time thing, right? So time to spend on one-time needs. And I understand we had some immediate needs, and I'm hearing you talk about trying to get some things in place for the future. It's just a little concerning to me that it sounds like almost everything that we've spent so far has been on staffing that may or may not need to be continued, right? And so as we talk about the next round of funding and the complications regarding actual construction and things like that, I would hope we could put some emphasis on that. And I'm also wondering if you said, I believe that when we first did our return, we did some investing. And I don't know if then we include that in this proposal to then get sort of a reimbursement and then it's additional revenue into our account. Is that what you were saying? And or moving forward, in addition to some of those types of needs, so actual HVAC and kind of system needs to have our buildings safe. Another conversation that I'm hearing a lot in our community is just sort of to bring some structures to our schools, to bring some joy and happiness to our schools, so that could be billed as mental health, particularly outside at the middle school and in other schools. I'm just wondering, or maybe outdoor learning places, we had those tents, and then, can we pay back those or get something that's more sustainable so that there's more outdoor learning, which I don't see really much of at the middle school. There's the one tent, I think, still at the high school. And so I'm just wondering about those types of ideas and things that could have more of a lasting impact that we wouldn't have as much need to continue to pay for.
Yeah, so outdoor learning spaces are absolutely on our wish list for our ESSER, in particular at moms. We've definitely had that conversation. It needs to go through that formal planning process before we can write it into the grant, and then that's the kind of project that would require this concept approval starting in February. You know, some of our positions, the literacy coordinator and the SEL coordinator, we wrote them into SR1 for 1 year with a plan that we followed through on to write them into SR2 for a second year. And the idea was always that these are temporary systems building positions. But, you know, as we're wrapping up year 2, these positions have either become so important that we will figure out how to make them sustainable. And ideally, with literacy, we've done something that has shored up tier 1, so we need less of tier 2, in which case perhaps we need fewer interventionists. That might be great. Or it might be that in fact, we invested big for a couple of years, we've really improved our practices, and we can let that tier of leadership go for a little while. It's not, we haven't had a literacy leader here in 4 or 5 years. So we'll have some decisions to make about which of these positions we sunset, and if we mean to sustain them, what else have we rendered no longer as critical by having this extra layer of leadership. I'm not sure that I answered all of your questions. I think there was one in there that I didn't understand about early investing.
Oh, like if we were to have invested already in some of the HVAC systems a few years ago, was that already covered by some grants, or would that be something that we could sort of get reimbursed for under this process?
You know, interestingly, I can't answer the question except that our public plan, and maybe either Logan or Bruce can, our public facing plan does ask us to put in context the other grants that we've drawn from. So if it looks like, hey, in our ESSER, we're doing nothing with HVAC, you can see, but actually we already have this grant where we already addressed some of these things. So we will have a more complete picture of the various COVID recovery grants we've drawn from to do those kinds of projects. You have been doing some.
Yes, last year we were able to access a little over $300,000 worth of grant funding to make HVAC improvements in the district. We focus primarily on Mary Hogan and Salisbury schools. And then there should be another round of grant funding coming through Efficiency Vermont that I may be able to access for more HVAC improvements. Certainly we've identified a number of them that we could use our ESSER for that's in Logan's paperwork. So, yeah. We're working on it.
Chip? It's also the case that one of the things the board will have to decide if we get there is what we're going to do with our fund balance. And the fund balance obviously is different, is large at this point, because we didn't spend so much as we normally would have, and other things last year. But a lot of that money could be designated toward projects which either don't match with ESSER or need to be done even sooner than we have to. So this is not an easy process to decide what, there's a number of places we're going to draw this money from, but to try to decide which is the most important and time-wise, which needs to be done first before something else is. So this is going to happen before we
are teed up
by the end
tonight to share the project that we talked about.
Okay.
So
Before we get to more questions, I want to get a sense of what's after Caitlin's presentation in the
we're going to go into Logan's going to present the first draft, and then we're going to talk about the ending fund balance.
Okay, great. Why don't we get to the first draft, because I've got a lot of these questions and we'll be able to incorporate into that. Caitlin, thank you very much. That was super helpful.
Slideshow. So we just spoke about this, but the bulk of what I'm going to say is going to touch on the budget environment. We'll start off with presentations by the 4 departments represented here tonight, and then I'll do a budget summary, mention some of the other budget drivers, and see how that all boils down to our tax rate. Followed by the discussion of our fund balance and a possible plan for that. So I'll segue now into presentations. First, we'll go on the tech budget, then Bruce facilities, Nicole special ed, and last but not least, Caitlin on curriculum and professional development.
And I'm going to ask board members to just be jotting down any notes that they have for each of these individual sections, and then we'll do those questions at the end so we can let everybody get through this. Thank you.
Gotta make sure people talk loudly. These masks really muffle certain voice tones of certain people. I know I'm a little deaf with that. I'm sorry, Jim, what?
What'd you say?
So the technology budget for next year is staying the same, very small change, going down a touch. I think that's probably a reflection of that we did have one employee leave last summer, Jeremy Holt, and he'd been here for a little while. He was replaced by a young man named Hunter McCrae, who was actually was an MUHS student at one point and DTC student. And he's been with us for a number of years. In the summer or vacations, played a really important role. The first part of the pandemic, kind of keeping that Chromebook fleet on the road. He's doing a really good job for us. So, but other than that, we have the same number of personnel. There's 6.8 total, including myself. There's a lot of fixed costs in the budget, things like our copier lease, for example, which is actually sunsetting in a couple of years. So we'll have to take a look at that at some point. I think it's September of not next year, but the year after that. The majority of the money that I spend on a more regular basis out of the budget comes from one line item that is called technology-related supplies. So that covers equipment, software subscriptions. We have a professional services line item that I use occasionally for consulting because we do hire an engineer when we need one. And it's not coming up as much anymore because we fixed a lot of the things that were broke in years past. But the budget's actually hasn't changed since the unification. It's been the same as this, with maybe slight changes every year. So it's things have gotten more expensive. A lot of the equipment is 25–30% more than it used to be. Chromebooks that used to cost $185 are costing $250 now. So we're trying to be creative, repairing a lot of things in-house, stocking parts, taking computers that are beyond repair and using those parts for other ones. So it's getting tighter, but I do think that this is adequate for next year. And we do have some bigger projects on the horizon, a couple of years out. We have a lot of server equipment that is going to be sunsetting its life. And I've been talking with Dr. Gross for a pretty long time now about maybe moving a lot of services to the cloud. So we're going to have to, make a decision about whether we need to make some big purchases for some of the server equipment that we currently have in every building, and perhaps move some services to the cloud, which could be a big benefit to all the staff, because it'll allow for access to resources from offsite, some of which are only available when you're on campus right now. Questions?
Or does it keep going through?
Right, keep going, right?
Yeah.
All right. So facilities, you'll see a slight increase, mostly representative of a half person increase in Salisbury School. We've gone through a couple of different cleaning contractors in the past, and for the last 2 years, we've had one full-time person there. That school is slightly larger than the outlying elementary schools, and it's been understaffed. So that represents staffing it with the right number of custodians to do the job. And then as far as the rest of the facilities budget, we're working hard to, we mostly employ reactive maintenance where we're fixing things as they break, and trying to judicious about how we approach requests. We have, furniture throughout the district that we shuffle around a lot, things like that, to try and save dollars. So we have basically a pretty well level funded budget for the upcoming year. And with that, we are also hoping that some of the larger things we'd like to tackle, we can draw on funds outside of the operating budget for facilities. And we'll jump into that in a few minutes.
Thank you. Good price. Just one clarifying, the number that you have under fiscal year 23 is not the same number as on the 12-17. Is that the reason? Logan? Fiscal year 23 proposed on the facility says 3340117, and that does not correspond to this FY23. I guess, am I missing something?
No, I agree with that.
I'll take the larger number.
Honestly, it must have been a change that I made either before or after doing these two and just didn't move it over to the correct one.
It does take, it changes the percentage change. That's
Yeah, no. I mean, there's what, $14,000 there that changed. That didn't make it either onto one or the other. So I apologize about that. In the end, I'll make it right.
Okay, special education. For those of you who have not been reading the Vermont Digger, the Addison Independent, and another publication that I can't think of, special education funding for next year is a little unclear at this point. Lots of great ideas out there. And so for us, we're pretty much going to try and have the exact same expenditures next year as we do this year. One reason is legally we have to, right? Maintenance of effort. The other reason is because my colleagues are doing such a fabulous job of building tier 1 and tier 2 practices that support kids' needs preventatively and proactively. We do have a decrease, an anticipated decrease in out-of-district tuition and transportation costs, both of which are significant costs in special education, and that accounts for the change. And other than that, we have no staffing changes on the horizon. And I imagine as the financial picture for special education funding in the state becomes more clear, we'll be able to adjust farther out into the future, but not for next year. This is also consistent with the estimated census block grant that we were given by the state. Thank you.
There is, just to add to the context of this, Act 173 has been a top of the conversation recently at the state level. There are some calling for a delay in 173. It's hard for me to tell right now whether that's gained enough momentum to tip over or not, but my read is that we could be in like a 50-50 scenario right now in terms of whether it's delayed or not.
So this last one is me. It's the smallest of these budgets. It does a lot of things for us. So the teaching and learning team actually includes 6.7 curriculum leaders. Only 2.0 FTE land in this budget. There's 0.9 is a historical position at the high school that remains in that budget of curriculum leadership there. And the rest of them are grant funded through Title II, Title IV, and now ESSER with literacy and SEL. So our curriculum leadership covers IB, literacy, SEL, and tech integration. And we don't anticipate any changes from what we budgeted for this year to what we're budgeting for next year in terms of those FTE and those personnel. We did have to reallocate one of our curriculum leaders this year to fill a staffing gap at Shoreham. But we haven't written that position out of next year's budget, so we aim to make that right and whole again next year. So also in this budget is course reimbursement funds that teachers can access through their master agreement allowances we have a pot of professional development funds that we use to bring speakers in, to send people out to trainings. We supplement that extensively with grant funds in a typical year, and including in this year. There's a travel line that we've been reallocating as we haven't been traveling. It's a relatively small line.
Virtually.
Trying to think what else is in there. We pay, in the summertime, we pay teachers stipends to do curriculum work, and that comes out of this budget. We also have provided teachers with small mini grants for curriculum materials and supplies that they can apply for in the summer, and that also comes out of this grant. Our IB annual fees come out of this budget line. And much like Will's, when he was saying that his budget hasn't changed much since we became ACSD, when we pooled our curriculum and our professional development resources back in 2017 to become ACSD, those became the funds that we use to pay for all of these things. A year or maybe two ago, we decided rather than having a separate curriculum and PD budget, we just pulled them into one. But the amounts have changed basically at the cost of employing highly qualified people to fill those leadership roles.
That it for those sections?
Yes, that's the four of them, yep.
Great. Folks, any questions on what was presented? Peter?
Bruce, for you, can you just tell us how much custodial work is being done now by outside contractors versus staff, ACSD staff?
We are 100% in-house.
Victoria?
Yeah, Nicole, I was hoping you could speak to how you look at budgeting if you were to say have in August, suddenly it comes on your radar, either there's a new student or maybe a current student who's gotten a new placement or something, but there's a big uptick related to special ed services. Do you build that in to that, or what, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's not built in, is the simple answer. We adjust as if students enter the system with high costs, we adjust. If the Act 173 changes go forward, the state, in addition to the Census Block Grant, will also be changing its formula for high cost students, so that we would actually receive more support for students that cost over a certain amount.
And would you be able to draw on that immediately, or do you not be able, you can't draw on that till the next?
That we would draw on as a reimbursement model.
You could, oh, okay. Thank you.
And the special ed budget as a whole is probably our most fluid one, because needs are shifting all the time. And one of the reasons we initially put the contingency into our budget was for these kinds of things where we don't want to ever be making a decision around student needs based on what we budgeted in special ed. We want to do it based on what's right. And so that contingency allows us a little bit more of that flexibility, especially with those kinds of costs that come up in September, October that you had no idea of right now.
Do student safety resources for buildings sit in facilities or technology? So locks, if you were to put in cameras, if you were to put in whatever, where would that sit, facilities or technology?
The camera systems have been coming out of facilities, although me and my staff do a lot of the work on them.
It's kind of a blurry.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a third department in between the two.
There's one between us too.
Facilities and IT have a lot of joint things that we work on together. But the actual equipment itself, like say camera equipment, has been coming out of facilities. The technology budget pays for things like internet filtering. The internet filter that we have to have for compliance purposes.
Okay.
That's more the capital.
Lindsay?
Where are capital improvements reflected in the budget? Do we have a separate or are there, do we have plans for capital improvements? We spoke about HVAC in Esther, but.
Yeah, they're not in the operating budget.
So that's just a separate budget?
No, I'm gonna give you a proposal tonight on how we might be able to use some, it's surplus money.
Yeah, it's a fund, and so historically, it's been a fund that we've allocated any fund balance into a capital reserve fund, which then Bruce has put together lists of different projects and has brought those to the board to approve, and then we've done them. So the last number of years, we put money into the capital reserve, and then we've ticked off some of the needs in our different buildings. And that's what we mentioned, I'll talk about later.
So we'll hear more about that at some point, or when the projects are proposed. Tonight, okay. And then I'm wondering with, Nicole, are you working with your budget? Is it reflecting only IEP students? Do the 504 IHP ASL, does that go into student teaching and learning? And so your budget is just the IEP students?
What I'm showing you is just the special education students on an individualized education plan. 504s are part of general education funding.
Okay, so all the other, the IHP and the ESL are also in general education?
You're using an acronym.
The health services and the English as a second language?
Right, all of that will be in a different.
Okay. And then I'm just wondering about the unfilled positions that have been spoken about. Where do those get reallocated to? Is it within the same budget, or does that go into sort of an umbrella fund such as the capital reserve?
So that all becomes, in terms of how the budget works, if we have, let's say we have 200 positions and 10 positions we can't fill. Those just sit in the current fiscal year budget, this current fiscal year budget. When we do the books after this year, and that will give us some kind of, unless we spent too much in our other categories of our budget, we'll end up with additional monies from those 10 positions, which will be our ending fund balance, which then we'll have the conversation we're having tonight around how we're going to allocate that.
Does it usually go into the capital reserve, or are there other pots that we would be deciding it should go in here or it should go in there?
I think Logan's going to talk about that. He's got a slide for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep moving.
All right, thank you, everyone. So now we'll go in, you can go to the next, yeah, I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so back to the title slide. So now we're going to talk about budget overview. As you've heard, staffing levels are expected to either be the same or slightly up. In the case of facilities, an extra half person in Salisbury. You heard the last meeting about few extra positions, 2 at MUMS and 1.8 at the high school. Those new positions account for about 300,000 of a budget increase for us. Another big piece of our budget is the wages and benefits. Of course, those are always substantial. We know, as Chip mentioned earlier, the teachers, we know we're going to be going up 3.5% next year. Support staff up 4.1% next year. That in concert, and I'll mention this later, with the health insurance increase, that's looking like about 1.1 million of a budget increase. Finally, another big piece is the transportation contract, which, to refresh everyone's memory,
Please don't.
is an escalating contract. So next year is year 4 of 5, and this will come up later as well, but about $200,000 more expensive next year. So between 300,000 new positions, 1.1 million of wage and benefit increases, 200,000 of transportation, you're looking at certainly over $1.5 million of increase. Those three things themselves make up the majority of the budgeted 5.6% increase to local ed spending, and you can see that on the next slide here. So that's the third line down, the ed spending, and you can go over to percentage change, 5.6% increase.
Could you specify a little better the vast majority, like of that 5.6%, how many points of that is those sort of fixed increases?
Yeah. So that's what, roughly 1.9 million there makes up the 5.6%. So what I just highlighted is 1.18, so for the wages and benefits, 1.18 million. So if you call that 1.2 plus 200,000 for transportation, that's 1.4 plus 300,000 for the new positions, 1.7. So I'm not going to pretend to try and do this off the top of my head, but if 1.9 million is 5.6%, 1.7 is 5%, something like that. I don't know if that didn't break it down per thing, but
It's very clear.
all right, thank you.
Basically, it's the difference between 1.7 million and 1.9 million.
Right, that difference is not accounted by those three factors.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So that launches right into it, but I wanted to start with the summary slide here, and then get into some of the other details. While we're still on this slide, you can see the equalized pupil numbers, which we just got last week.
Logan, I'm sorry, right
sorry,
there.
yes.
Just for some of the new board members and just so it's in the record, could you just explain each of these categories? Just put a little summary for what do you mean by expenditures? What do you mean by local revenue?
Please,
Just-
yeah,
that'd be
of
great.
course, thank you. So expenditures is everything that the school district plans to spend. All money spent by the school district. Local revenues, which I realize is a little bit of a misnomer because that combines locally generated revenues as well as grant revenue. So that's, local revenue is incorrect. It should just say revenue, which is anything coming in the door to offset the amount that our school district is spending. So if the school district in this FY23 column, if the school district is going to spend 42 million, there is around 7.5 million of offsetting money coming in the door, resulting in ed spending, which is what needs to get made up by the local tax base. All right, great, thank you.
Yeah, quick question. So when I'm looking at the detail sheet, ESSER funds are included in that local revenue difference. So that number is still in flux a little bit depending on, we haven't allocated all of our ESSER directly.
Yeah, so that the ESSER is an in and an out. So the ESSER is part of the 42 million and it's part of the 7.4 million. So even without ESSER, the 34 million would be the same. Does that answer your question?
No, I was just, basically, because in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, the ESSER funding on the sheet is less. And the explanation that we had earlier was that that's because we haven't allocated it. So some of the revenue decline will probably come up a little bit once we allocated the ESSER,
Yeah,
correct?
the expenditure line will increase and the revenue line will increase
Right.
too, but the local ed spending will stay the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that big ESSER, the third chunk of ESSER, that
Yeah.
big pot.
Yeah, because at first when I look at it, I said, oh my gosh, our local revenues have gone down, but then I realized on the detail that the ESSER funds haven't been fully,
Yeah, that big 3.3 million third chunk.
Yeah.
If that gets factored in, let's say 1.5 million of it next year, well, the 42 million would go up by 1.5 million, and the 7.486 million would go up by 1.5 million.
right. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Great.
And one thing just to ask, related to equalized pupils, so this, as we talk about every year, this is a crucial number for us, and when we get it, it really kind of means everything. Last year, we were in a position where the state said, your equalized pupil number can stay the same, but it can't go down, but it can go up, essentially is what they said. So our number was potentially held. I don't recall getting any data from the state saying, that you went down, and we just basically had the same number both years. So I assume we went down a slight bit. So our 25 drop is potentially related to what happened last year where we were held artificially at the same level.
Yeah, no, please, thank you. So, you know, an increase in ed spending and a drop in equalized pupils has an effect of actually increasing this bottom line here to this ed spending per equalized pupils to 7.1%. So for example, if we had left equalized pupils the same, if we assume the same equalized pupils of 1,735, well, then the ed spending per equalized pupil would be 19,956. It'd be 5.6% increase, not a 7.1% increase. So the last piece of the puzzle as far as our tax rate goes is the property yields, which I'll touch on shortly. But first, I just wanted to highlight a couple of these other budget drivers that I mentioned. One, enrollment, equalized pupils, which I just touched on, but I'll just revisit it after mentioning the enrollment piece. And a couple other budget considerations, and then we'll get into the tax commissioner's letter, which talks about the property yield. So, sorry, please, yes. So, as is evident in the letter that was part of the meeting material, enrollment is expected to be exactly the same next year. The middle school and Mary Hogan numbers went slightly down. The high school and a couple of elementary schools, Bridgeport and Cornwall, went slightly up, but overall, a perfectly flat number, somewhat surprisingly. Or somewhat, I don't know, coincidental, whatever you want to call it, but exactly flat enrollment for next year.
And one of the indicators here that we watch is that impacts us is the weighting. So we've been talking about the weighting study. The final report just came out. I don't know if anyone here has spent any time with it. Interesting. The weighting for secondary students is higher than for elementary students. So you can have, when you look at enrollment and you think, well, we're the same enrollment, why? We've had the same enrollment for 3 years. Why are our equalized pupils going down? It's because we're losing secondary students. There are other factors too that are involved in the weighting, but that is why figuring out the equalized pupil number is very, very challenging, and most business managers will not even try because it's not really worth attempting to figure that number out with the data that we have. So that is kind of something that we've been experiencing over the last, 7 or 8 years. Our large classes, our historically large classes in Addison County have started to shrink. And so we've seen them go up through the elementary, up to secondary, and then some of these really large classes. And those of you who have been here a long time know we had classes of, Kathy, what were some of our really big classes? 200?
That was a long time.
180,
yeah. And now we're at the 115, 120 numbers. Seems like where we are. So anyway, that has had a big impact on our budget.
Chip, but if that number, if the secondary number has gone down, that's assuming some of those students that you were teaching in elementary, they're gone to private school or moved out of the area or something's happened. Is that correct? I mean, why?
What's happening is that I think these classes are graduating, and then the classes coming underneath are smaller, and they're not necessarily changing dramatically in size. It's like people are having fewer kids and a host of other kind of economic and social factors. From what I've seen, the cohort sizes have stayed relatively stable if you track them across grades. Like our total second grade, then the next year total third grade size has stayed somewhat at the same level.
So we've addressed this quite a bit already, but 1.4% decrease in the equalized pupils. Worth noting, it's a 2-year average. So, you know, for example, if high school numbers, let's say, if a number, maybe next year it went up, as we see in the chart, but maybe the number 2 years ago that's falling off the back end was in fact a higher number than that year. So it's certainly not a simple matter of, oh, we have 24 less students in the district. It's a little more complicated than that. But as it stands, the preliminary number we received last week is down by 24, down 1.4%. So finally, a couple other drivers, a couple other considerations, and then quickly the tax letter and ultimately the tax rate. The budget drivers, and this is, I'm not going to go too far into this, but wages and salaries expected to increase. We talked about the volume of that increase, a little over 1.1 million. Health insurance, as Chip mentioned at the beginning, we expect another substantial increase to that. And I got a little bit ahead of myself. It's not just wages and salaries up to 1.18 million. Wages and benefits, all those combined, expected to make up that number. So certainly significant there. Tax 173, I think it's just worth noting. Peter already mentioned there might be a delay on this, but it's a shift from a reimbursement for it's a shift for the majority of special ed expenditures from a reimbursement model to a block grant model. We expect that if this does play out, that our special ed funding would go down over time, but it's expected to phase in. So even if it does go through as planned and there's no delay, we don't expect our numbers to decrease much next year. It shouldn't be a big impact next year because of this phase in on the change. But thought it was worth mentioning. Finally, another thing to mention is the transportation. We talked about it, $200,000 increase next year. We're in year 4 or 5 of an escalating contract, and there's a big bullet to bite there. So last but not least, let's talk. Yes.
What number did you build in for a health insurance increase? You said you don't know.
Yes, we don't know. For right now, and this was a recommendation from my mentor and other business managers, well, other business managers and representatives of the state, that a safe bet would be a 10% increase. We are expecting less than that, but it won't be finalized. My understanding is until early 2020. So right now, it's in there at 10, with the hope, I guess, that it'll be less of an increase than that.
Sorry? Yeah, can you just remind me on the transportation, I know we're in year 4 or 5, but is it a 5-year contract and we renegotiate them?
Yes. Yes.
At end of next year?
Right, so next year's year 4, the following year's year 5, during year 5, that would occur.
And we did build that with like we didn't take it all in the chin in year 1.
Right.
So it is going like this.
Right, no, I remember that, and I think the assumption is that year 6 or first year of the new contract, the increase will continue.
That's not my hope.
No, not our hope, but
Are you a realist or?
yeah.
One of the other assumptions was that hopefully over time we could make it, we were in the process of deciding whether we would be changing what schools were going and all the other things. So we were hoping we could not economize, but make it more effective as far as bus routes. As Superintendent Wisconsin pointed out, there's nothing more difficult than figuring out bus routes and having everybody be happy. So I don't know. Maybe that's a pie in the sky, but that was one of the things we used also.
Yeah. I mean, when this happened, Betcha and the parent company decided, I mean, they did this with other districts too. So this same increase happened in Colchester and Randolph and a few other districts who were negotiating at the time. So this was not just us. It was what they shared was they had to make it more profitable essentially.
Well, and also part of it was they needed to increase salaries for bus drivers because they couldn't hire bus drivers at the current rate.
Yeah.
Right, wasn't that a concern?
And is there any district in the state of Vermont that operates its own transportation lots?
Otter Valley being the nearby example.
And Champlain Valley too, yeah.
And my understanding is that the Budget Transportation Solution is, we're negotiating with one vendor. We don't have the opportunity from a negotiation perspective to negotiate with anyone else.
And we don't know if that
In
would be
general
true,
negotiation terms.
what we could, yeah.
But this is probably some questions, but I'll ask it. Since there are districts that do operate their own, would there be the ability, since they have kind of managed infrastructure in place, would we be able to maybe partner with them and have them manage our transportation for us at the Powder Creek or?
They might be able to help with some of the administration, but I would imagine that wouldn't be a big savings. I mean, it would, you know, if you were going to build your own transportation system, you know, you'd probably save it a little bit, but I don't think it would be significant. I mean, there has been talk of it, like, would it make sense to look at that?
Yeah.
I'm certainly wouldn't want to be holding that right now, because I've looked at how challenging that is and all the other work that we're doing.
Right.
Well, talking to other superintendents who do
Take
buses,
them.
it sounds like a really hard road.
But that's why, if they already figured it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Have them help.
Well, I think as we get closer to, you know, the end of this contract, I think we'll be looking at all those kinds of options. It's a huge initial investment, obviously.
Well, one conversation I had recently with a couple of the other business managers was coming together as sort of one contract offer of, hey, if we're big enough, maybe more than one suitor would come to the table with a potential contract. I don't know any much viability on that. It was a conversation, but hey, did we only get Betcha in the mix because we were too small, kind of thing, where if we could get big enough, would there be more than one vendor?
I mean, there are like a couple big, you know, STAs that we're with, which is Mountain Transit, Betcha. They keep the local names to keep them feeling local, but it's not, it's just the national.
Okay.
Things to consider.
Let's keep going.
Yep. So anyways, last but not least, tax rate. So there are three pieces to the equation. Local ed spending and equalized pupils, which we talked about. And the third thing is property yield. Now, every year, the tax commissioner comes out with a letter on December 1st, which is included in the material, and recommends what property yields should be. This year's letter, as we go on, conservatively recommends an impressive 14.3% increase to the property yield. This is driven by the increase in Vermont real estate. That's great. You know, higher yield means lower tax rates. Awesome. But it needs to be kept in mind that there's a possible CLA offset to that. So the CLA, common level appraisal, accounts for any disparity between values, actual market values, and the appraised values of those properties. So my understanding is if there's there's maybe a little bit of a lag to that. So property values up, there may be some lag to the appraised values of those things catching up. So there could be a significant CLA decrease this year to account for that disparity. So the point is, some of this increased yield could be offset by a decrease in the CLA.
Peter?
Just to add a little more context to this December 1st tax letter that comes out from the Commissioner of Taxes. It's a statutorily required letter, and it has to do its calculations based on the statute. And so in the education fund, which is what funds the school system in Vermont, there's actually an unprecedented $90 million surplus right now. By law, the tax letter has to recognize that $90 million surplus. The legislature does not have to recognize that letter. So I would say that, you know, this wonderful property yield increase, which is a good thing, because a yield up means tax rates down. it won't be that much because obviously there's going to be a lot of competition for a $90 million. You know, the governor himself has even said he'd like to apply 45 of it to necessary programs.
So you're saying you could, a bet, more safe assumption would be half of that.
I don't know how the whole state grant list enters into that calculation.
Yeah.
But I certainly can say that it won't be as.
It won't be that number.
Yeah. And it's something for us to keep in mind.
So unless I'm reading this wrong, I know I'm new to this party, that 12,900 is assuming that none of the 90 million gets used. If the whole 90 million gets used, it's 13,800. I might be, here's the letter. I might be wrong. So that's why I said conservatively, the 14.33%, assuming none of the 90 million gets used.
Okay, excellent.
Right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it could be better. So to your guys' point, if half of it gets used, what's halfway between 12,900 and 13,800? 13,400. So if 12,900 conservatively, maybe 13,400. Anyway,
Great, thank you.
thank you.
And I think part of our hope with this yield number, which is, you know, higher than we've ever seen, an increase in that number, that it offsets in terms of the tax effect, which Logan's going to mention, that it offsets that increase and the loss of people for this year.
Yep.
You keep that up nicely. Oh, please go on.
Yeah, when does remind me, when's the SLA numbers come out?
CLA?
CLA, I'm sorry. CLA, thank you.
Logan, do you have an update from the state?
No, we just talked about this tonight earlier. I think soon. I don't have it. It's soon, if not imminent. I don't know more than that right now.
We usually have it by the new year.
Yeah, because I was told the whole.
But I would say the last 2 or 3 years, these dates have been really erratic.
Yeah, even equalized pupils is typically December 15th, and I think we got it on the 16th this year, but I think you might have mentioned last year, it was not the 15th.
It's like March.
Yeah, so yeah, good question.
2 weeks later.
So even if I knew.
Let's keep going.
Yes, even if it was the 31st, it might not be then. So anyway, so at this point, we've established that the locally funded portion of our budget is anticipated to be up. We've also said that at least preliminarily, equalized pupils are down, but property yields are up. With all this in mind, we'll look at how the movement of these factors affects our tax rate to see our estimated tax rate. So I can be quick about this, but I'll jump to the third one like I did on the other slide. If ed spending is expected to go up, the tax rate is expected to go up. If equalized pupils is expected to go down, the tax rate is expected to go up, which I see that's a down arrow there, but that's the movement of the tax rate if the component, if equalized pupils goes up. Anyway, I thought this was in there last year, so it was in there this year. But it explains the movement of the different pieces and how it affects the tax rate. The point is, ed spending up, we talked about ed spending up, equalized pupils down, property yield up. So, taking all that into account, our district tax rate is expected to go down by 5% if you go to the next slide. That number is in the bottom right-hand corner, the minus 4.9%, taking all these factors into account. So despite this kind of the story, pending the CLA. So the story is, despite higher expenses, lower revenues, and fewer legalized people, the significant change in real estate more than offsets all that, which puts us pending a CLA, which might put us closer to plan.
Great. Any questions?
Just a comment. I'm kind of worried about the CLA because I'm sure towns haven't an appraisal in the last, that reflects the new prices. So I'm a little nervous about that.
Any other comments or questions? Great.
the last piece before we get into the fund balance is just to give you guys a heads up on what we're expecting as far as next steps. Final adjustments, health insurance, we talked about. Tech center, finalizing exactly what tech center tuition will be. We're still waiting on some of that information. Finalizing equalized pupils, I mentioned those numbers are preliminary. Those are the kind of things that'll provide more clarity. Of course, the CLA, second bullet point there. And then as far as next steps, obviously the proposed use of fund balance, what to do with the fund balance is something that gets addressed at town meeting day. So that will obviously be coming as well. Specifically for tonight regarding fund balance, I wanted to paint a little picture first before Bruce has a little presentation for you guys. I think it's important to mention what our current reserves are. It kind of tells a story of, hey, there are savings that exist. It's, I think, you know, kind of a financial 101 true financial sense is, hey, you should have a little cash cushion, you know, don't go, oh, you have how much money? Let's spend it all and put us back to zero. So I think we wanted to highlight the fact that some savings exists. We have little money in the piggy bank kind of thing, if you will. So that leads us to the fund balance piece. Unassigned fund balance from last year is the 2 point. This is unaudited at this point. Is expected to be 2.3 million. The fact that it's not exactly an audited fund balance, I should put that disclaimer in there. It's not audited yet, but certainly our auditors have provided us this number that they feel good about, 2.3 million. It's worth noting, hey, where'd that come from, right? The major story of that, which came up earlier tonight, is COVID-related savings. Just the word there is less travel, less in-person activity. Less referees for sporting events. There's things that we expected to spend money on, like Chip said, that didn't happen. So, anyways, cash reserves in place. What do we do with the fund balance? And Bruce is going to talk about an idea of what to do with it.
All right. Okay. So our high school kitchen has served us well. Has not been updated since the building was built. So we have a 1956 kitchen. And just to back up a little bit, we did do some code updates in 1997 when we had a major project. Next slide. Okay, so school was built in 1956. We partially renovated the kitchen in 97 to meet some codes that included a hood vent. It included 80% of the electrical in the kitchen, a good portion, and we added an outdoor freezer. The freezer actually came 2 years later, but was sorely needed. Next slide. So those are the pieces we bought in 1997. Next slide. So the current deficiencies that we're facing, and many of these get noted on our health inspections. We have failing sewer drains. We've had to reroute some of the drain lines to other sewer lines under the slab that are still intact. We do still have an outdated electrical panel in there. The wall surfaces don't meet the current kitchen codes or food preparation codes. We just have painted block walls. That's not adequate anymore. Our refrigeration, the original walk-in cooler from the 50s is not large enough for the meal program we run today. We actually have, I believe, 6 other refrigerators stuck into the kitchen in different places. And then it's just an inefficient layout. You know, if you've ever been through the kitchen and happy to take on a tour, it's pretty tough. Next slide. There's a drain we rerouted under the sink to what used to be a floor drain. The flooring is failing. It's asbestos tile. Really needs to be dealt with. There's some old electrical that we'd like to have completely redone. Next slide. Good. You know, it's just generally in poor condition. And next slide. original walk-in cooler door. Now that's pretty cool.
I know.
We do like the door.
Circa 56.
Circa 56, that's how they used to build. And it's lasted a long time. Next slide. Okay, so we asked Truex Collins to just take a 30,000-foot view of this project and work with an estimator to develop an initial, what they call a cost opinion. So in the architect's and builder's opinion, if we were to do this project immediately, we should plan on spending roughly $2.6 million. So that would repair our drains under the slab, which we will need to cut up the slab to get to. That would address the lack of any ventilation in the kitchen other than the hood vent. The hood vent that's there is now also out of code. Met the code in 97, no longer meets the code. It would, resurface the floors with the proper tile, resurface the walls, change the configuration enough so the kitchen could function more efficiently. And so this project clearly won't fit into our operating budget. And it is something that we need to tackle sooner than later. There is the potential that one day we just might come in and the drains aren't working correctly, and we would have to relocate food service out of this building, which, I'm sure being Vermonters, we can overcome any challenge. However, to put ourselves through that, I think would be difficult. So in my opinion, this kind of rises to the top out of projects that would not qualify for SR funds, given that it's not COVID related directly, but needs to be done as soon as we can. So as you think about the fund balance that needs to get voted on as we warn what to do with it, we have, a good portion of funds already in reserve that this board can access, but not enough to do this whole project. So when you are considering what to do with the fund balance, please consider taking on this project.
And just from a clarification perspective, you will make a formal ask then of the board for a specific amount to be allocated out of the fund balance for this, or should we consider how to clarify process for folks?
Yeah, so this is our initial presentation on what our recommendation is for the fund balance, and we did talk to the finance committee about this prior to bringing this forward. So,
so folks will get a formal, formal request that would be put forward. Amy, you had it, and then Chip.
Just a quick question. I'm just trying to recall when we were doing estimates before and what the improvements were for the high school, what that larger number was, and I'm assuming that this was part of that?
No, the estimates before were just to bring systems up to code. So, and they did not realize when that group came through and did that estimate, did not realize that pipes were failing underneath the slab. They did not account for lack of ventilation in the kitchen. They didn't look at things like that.
So it's not like we gained.
No.
I mean, we gained, but I meant in terms of that number. Yeah, thank you.
One thing, there's $200,000 sitting in the health fund. How do we, that fund was set up before the health, in the transition to the state system, when we didn't know what we were going to be faced with. That money, I guess, I don't know how we changed that, not that that's a big part of it, but we could move that into one of the other funds. We as a board can do that, or does that have to be?
I believe when we checked, and I think Brittany checked on this, the board could take action on that outside of this whole process, outside of the budget process, just at a meeting.
All I'm saying is that's
Yeah,
kind of piece.
that's how I remember Brittany's interpretation. Peter and then Barb.
Yeah, so not for tonight, but maybe when we do get a more formal presentation, we can also kind of have a fund balance, reserve fund 101.
Yeah.
So we can talk about the education reserve, the capital reserve, the HRA reserve. And I actually know we dealt with this HRA thing.
I thought so too. I thought we voted to put it in the education fund.
Yeah,
But,
education reserve.
yeah.
We talked about it, but we
Okay.
All action.
look,
I don't think we've ever done that.
Unless we move some of it. But, I mean, it would make sense, kitchen is sort of health related, it would make sense to move that 200 into.
Barb? Yeah, so with upgrading the kitchen, obviously the appliances, things that are in there are super old and have to be very inefficient. So as we get new equipment in there and fewer refrigerators and, more consolidation, do you anticipate savings in the overall operations going forward?
Yes, I think we can anticipate savings. I don't know if I can quantify it exactly.
Right, yeah.
But yes, it would be more efficient, I think both from a personnel standpoint as well as just the efficiency of how well the other works.
Okay. Just on reserve funds, history too. We've been generally fortunate over many years, I think, of having some reserve fund every year, which means either good budgeting or luck, or like COVID, it caused a shift in things. And we've had this discussion of how to use those reserve funds to present to the public. Last year was an exception for both members that weren't here, because we were so close to the threshold at that point that this board then made the judgment to take half of the reserve and apply it toward next year's budget as revenue. Now, that's commonly said, giving it back to the taxpayers or whatever you want to call it. We're not in the same position this year at all, so that's why it's sort of a really different place than we were at the same time last year. This money is, all that money has already been voted on by the public. And we put it in a fund, so we then have the chance to use it as we see fit. Specifically, to apply it to something else in the school. We're not obligated to, quote, turn it back as revenue.
Mary Heather?
I just have a quick question for you, Bruce. Have we gotten sort of letters of non-compliance or anything from the state or whatever health code? I mean, do we have, just to give us a sense of the urgency?
We have records from over the past couple of years of health inspectors, marking off that the flooring's inadequate, that the wall makeup is incorrect. So we haven't received a letter saying you must correct these or we're closing your kitchen.
But are we playing with disaster in your opinion?
That's what it feels like.
Okay, thank you.
Lindsay?
Is this the only company that we've gotten any type of project estimate from? Have we looked at other like Addison County programs, or this reads to me like a state-of-the-art type of renovation? Have we looked at other approaches to the renovation where everything is done, but some large appliances that are in good shape are kept, or what other options would we have where it might come in at a different price point?
I would say that you could use any licensed reputable firm. They're going to come up with pretty much the same number. This is a cost opinion, so this isn't saying, okay, well, if we keep this 6-burner stove and don't buy a new one, we're going to save $4,000. This is a very high view of what the project will cost, and it's a large enough project, and there's enough regulation involved that you're not going to vary a whole lot when you go to bid with actual plan specifications. You're not going to see a lot of difference between the high bid and low bid, whether it's somebody who lives in Middlebury or it's a firm out of Williston. They're all.
And do you think, can you speak a little bit to why you think it's so high? I mean, when I think about a commercial kitchen that the for a restaurant that serves as many as we serve in a day, I think the number would be a lot less. Is a lot of the cost built into code, or because we've got to do demo that is expensive, or?
We have to do demo that's expensive. There's a pretty good contingency in there because we don't know exactly what's deteriorated underneath our concrete slab and what's not. Since one pipe is completely rusted away, there's a good chance the others are in very poor condition. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, the town had to do a force main replacement up the street because the soils here erode the cast iron pipe. And so that's what's happened. I'm sure that's what's happened in our kitchen.
Yeah.
Just geographically, we're so close to that.
So I can't see that. Is there a line item there for demo, or?
Let's see, we have abatement, we have fire, professional services. It doesn't say specifically demo.
Yeah.
Demo will be part of the construction.
But it's your understanding that that's a big part of it?
That's going to be a big part because we basically need to rip everything out and start over. And that's, you're constructing a new building within a building.
And the demo is,
And the demo is,
yeah, that's correct.
yeah.
Well, and again, this is just, we're at opinion stage right now.
We're at opinion
so
stage, so we think this is what it's going to cost.
Directionally, right?
Direction.
Okay.
Yes.
Lindsay, and then we're gonna keep going on this.
If this is something that we will be reviewing at a future meeting, I would be curious to know what other, what are your top three as we consider this project? And without going into so much detail, I'm sure with a building built in 1956, there are probably other things. And so I would be interested in your top 10 list or your top 5 list or something, even as we just kind of consider, going forward this year and in the future.
Yes.
Peter?
Just one thing to clarify in this process, which I think has changed a bit over the years. So over the last few years, we've been moving funds into our capital reserve, and then the board has been taking action on the specific items when we brought them forward. So in terms of a technicality, the warning that we write is going to, if the board approves it, to move this 2.3 into capital reserve. And then we can, in terms of the official language, and then the board has the ability, and we've made this change maybe 3 or 4 years ago when we asked the voters if the board could do this, and the voters said yes, then we would come forward to the board and say, is this the thing? But we felt that it's more helpful to share with the community what we're thinking about, instead of just putting money aside and not, people, in the community not knowing what it's going to be used for. So we just want to share that.
I was just going to share one last thing, a little bit to Lindsay's point. I've got students at the high school, and I know that, for example, every time it rains, there's, a trash can that needs to be dragged out into the gymnasium to catch some of the leaks from the roof. So for this to rise to the top and not to be mentioned, I think should provide perspective for the board members about, one, how urgent it is, and two, just, where it falls on the list of definitely other obvious needs at the high school.
Roofs in the top line.
There we go. So just to provide that perspective.
Go ahead, Lola.
No, I was saying Lindsay had her hand up.
Oh,
No, we're
not this time.
Yeah, here.
Oh, I don't have anything else.
All set?
I'm all done, sorry.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
So we had some really good charts, and could those just be attached to the minutes somehow? And, if we have the minutes and then all these great charts, have them just attached, so we would all have copies of them.
They're in the meeting materials.
Yeah, they're in the meeting materials.
They're posted
Is
online.
not all the presentations that we had
Sharon said she would, anything that's not in there now, she'll get me tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
didn't know.
She mentioned that.
Yeah, I would love to see Caitlin's and Logan's. They were great presentations.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, next up, report of the board, thank you, Logan. And I know this is your first go around with the school board budgets that we're presenting you the budget to the board. So thank you very much for the work that you're putting into this. We appreciate it. And to the finance team for helping them through this.
And even doing an extra meeting, I said, can you meet me with
All
one
good.
extra?
Hey, it takes a village, man. It takes a village.
Thank you.
The next thing up, as we had discussed at the last board meeting, we wanted to put position language together that we were, oh, yeah. Thank you all very much for being here and for presenting your budgets. If at this time you would like to perhaps do something else, we would strongly support that decision.
Thank you.
Don't want to think about that, have you? Thank you all very much.
Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays. Great, so as we had discussed during the last conversation, where we reviewed requests that Ripton was making as a result of where we stand in the process with the State Board of Education, we thought it was important to codify what we had shared as a board and our reaction and comments to that. And I know that you know, in anything like this, we're trying to say this at a macro level. We're trying to say this in a way that directionally we as members of the board can support this statement, the majority of the board. And so what I tried to do is put language together that reflected what the majority of the board agreed on or shared that we agreed on. So I'm just going to read this through. I was driving today, and so I believe this was shared with you. Victoria sent it out via email. I believe that this reflects a summary of what the majority of the board communicated during that discussion and tries to highlight our areas of agreement with the Ripton board. And I think that's important. The issue regarding petitions that they had presented in their outline is not reflected below, is because I don't believe this was an area where we agreed in principle with Ripton. And so with that, the position statement would be, the ACSD board has heard the request made by the Ripton School Board. We believe we are in agreement in principle with the following. Number one, collaboration and transparency with those we serve is critical as we move forward to address the issues we face together as a community. As you all recall, one of the discussions that we had was with regards to creating criteria, and would that criteria be clearly articulated? We then had a debate and discussion as to whether or not such specificity around criteria needed to be in a charter change. And as the majority of the board came kind of to an agreement that we did not believe it should be in a charter change, we needed flexibility, but that it would be a reasonable expectation to achieve supermajority of this board that there would need to be clarity and specificity with regards to a school being asked to close. And then number two, in circumstances when it becomes necessary to close or reconfigure any ACSD school, those circumstances and reason for closure must be clearly articulated and shared with all community members. So, you know, we're trying to do a couple things here. We're trying to demonstrate that, yes, there needs to be open and collaboration and transparency, and we're trying to ensure that once we have gone through that process, through collaboration and transparency, that those decisions would be clearly articulated and shared. And that it's these two principles that they were asking for in their requests. They wish that a charter change reflected those. Further, the ACSD board believes no changes to our charter are required to demonstrate these commitments. We look forward to working with our community as we seek to find ways of ensuring equity and opportunity for the children we serve. So while we are in agreement in principle with these two kind of major ideas, we did not believe that a charter change is required. The next step in this process is, you know, the State Board of Ed is going to say to Ripton, where are you in this process? What work have you done to try to find a resolution? And I think it's going to be important for us to have our position statement available for the state board. My recommendation would be that this is the statement that we share from the paragraph that starts the ASC board has heard all the way down to the paragraph and including further the ACSD board believes no changes. So I'd like to put that forward for consideration for the board. We would be taking an action on that, so we would need a majority to say yes. The first thing I would like to do is to get a motion on it. Chip?
I'll make the motion.
Great, so a motion to approve the position as shared regarding the Ripton School Board and the requests that have been submitted. Could I get a second? Victoria, comments and discussion. Victoria, then we'll come around.
I think it's great. I think it summarizes really well sort of what came out of our discussion. In the number 2, I wonder if that might be read when you say reconfigure any ACSD school. There was as part of their request, they talked about when principals reconfigured classrooms, having community involvement in deciding that. And I don't think that's what you intend there about reconfiguring within an individual school. And I just wondered if others think that it might be read that way.
Well, you want the idea of repurposing.
Right, right. We could change the word to repurpose. Yeah, that might be greater clarity. Chip, I'm sorry.
No, Barb next.
Barb and then Chip.
Yeah, and I don't, so when I read this versus when you talked about it, it didn't stand out as much that under 1 would be a commitment to actually have upfront the criterion that we're going to be using in our decision making. So what I think would make it maybe more clear is included in item 2 would basically just say that before we talk about the reasons for closure, that we would take any criterion that will be used to decide what school or schools are to be closed.
See, and I think that was the root of the debate in that what we're saying is that for a supermajority to vote to close a school, it would be a realistic expectation that criterion and process and understanding as to why that school is closing and why it received supermajority vote, and that's a realistic expectation.
So in my view, instead of whenever I assume I get in trouble, so why not just state it then in item 2, and as opposed to say it's an expectation? Because there will be,
It says must be clearly articulated.
That's after the fact. I'm just saying that as we start the process, we would talk about having criteria. This is what we're going to be looking at. This is how we're going to use the data that we're gathering.
Yeah,
so it's not just after the fact.
Right, and I guess I hesitate with that because the idea that there's going to be some 4 things that we know in advance of going down a process to identify which schools we may have to reconfigure or close. And we're not going to learn from that process. And so those 4 things might become 6 things. Those 6 things might become 2 things. I think puts us in a very limited position. So to say we're only going to look at these 4 things at the beginning of a process, and no matter what we learn in that process, well, it wasn't one of those 4 things, so now we can't consider it, I think limits us. And having gone through this for the past, seems like a lot of years, I've learned a ton that I didn't know enough in the very beginning to put on a list. And so I really hesitate that we think we know it all in the beginning and not allow us to learn as we go through that process. But what we do owe the public, and what I do think we all can agree on, is that before anybody's going to vote to close a school, that criterion must be clearly understood and articulated. For whatever we want. So that would be my argument.
I could still think there is some upfront information that could be provided, and part of it could then be, and as we learn, we'll add to this criterion. You know, yeah, I agree that it is in fact a living process to some extent. As you know, you uncover something here, then there's maybe more under the stone that you turned over that you have to consider. But I think it would be more in line with what they're asking for. You know, like many people would look at this and say, well, this is no different than it is today. What are we doing different?
Other comments or questions?
I guess I would have a question sort of directed toward your comment, Barb, about, I mean, it seems to me that the issue is to ensure that a decision to close a school is not arbitrary, right? Like it's not just on a whim without supporting information, without data to justify that action, correct? So, I mean, is it just a matter of, you know, in circumstances when it becomes necessary, the circumstances, the justifying information or supporting information, I mean, maybe it's just making sure that, you know, that the language includes data, information, something more than just reasons. Is that kind of what you're trying to get at? That it's not just an arbitrary thing, but that it's grounded in something tangible?
It's, yeah, that in the end result is very tangible. It's, you know, face it, it's a hard decision. And when you look across the various schools, it's going to be hard to choose one versus the other. So the more detailed that we can be, and a growing list of criterion is a great idea. I agree, but you have to start out a process where you're basically saying, well, this is how we're going to evaluate it based on all the data that we've gathered and continue to gather, because it's a hard process.
Well, so I'm wondering maybe, you know, maybe the language that we say is the process by, or the information and data and the process by which that information and data were evaluated, all of those things could be, you know, specified in here, and that all of that needs to be shared with the ACSD community, rather than just, you know, kind of reasons, which is a bit vague, but maybe some language that's a little more, but we're not constricting ourselves to a certain process or certain categories of data that we don't know yet. Does that seem like a reasonable bridge, perhaps?
Peter?
So when I read that, I felt like it did, in fact, encapsulate very much what I sort of heard as a consensus of the board last week. You know, Barb says, well, how is this different than what we're doing now? I say it's not. I would say that we haven't even reached that point yet. But I think when we talk about, you know, this is a kind of a statement of commitment. It's not a process description. And, you know, the process description is something that the board comes up with when it actually goes down this road. It's really just a statement of philosophical commitment. You know, like I said, I think the rest of it is really just a detailed process that would not be part of this.
Lindsay?
When I read this, it's eloquent and to the point. And I think it does reflect the conversation that we had at the last meeting. At the same time, when I read the details of the November 11th document from Ripton, I wonder if this response will sort of speak to the, you know, they had the 4 points, and I like the idea of focusing on our areas of agreement. But at the same time, they listed 4 points, and some of those have been brought together in our 2 points. But I just wonder if this will satisfy the dialogue, this step of the dialogue, would we want to consider speaking to the 4 points in a more direct way? It could be this, it's a really nicely worded statement, but I feel like if they have 4 points, and for example, number 4, the composition of the district board, where, the idea of petitions, to just speak to that and say, there were some good answers at the last meeting, and I wasn't one of the people who replied, but about petitions, and, one of the answers was, with the at-large and the charter change, I don't know. But, the way that it's written, I guess I would be looking to speak more directly to their 4 points, even if it does bring up some ways that we are not in agreement with them. Because I keep hearing, negotiate and mediate, and that, I don't know, it would be nice if we could avoid that, the time and the expense of that. And that, it seems like they're looking for us to make some concessions or to move, and if we're just not going to, then to come out and say that might, like the composition of the Unified School District Board, like, I don't get the sense that we are considering a charter change, so to just say we're not willing to, that's not within the scope of the work that the school board does, you could go to each town individually and ask them to, put it on their ballot or whatever the process would be. I'm not familiar with that, but.
And I think that, to quickly just comment on that one, I think that last sentence does reinforce that we do not believe there is a need for a charter change.
So that would speak to number 4.
Speak to number 1.
It would speak to all.
It would speak to all of them. That
They were all
essentially charter changes, and I don't know what other road they could take as an entity to try to make this go forward. I don't know if it's an option to go to each town individually and ask that, have another way of trying to revise the charter. If they can get the charter on the ballot, they as the Ripton School Board. If there's another avenue to get the charter on the ballot, I don't know what that might be, Does it have to come from us, or would they then say, well, the school board isn't going to help us with this charter change, so what are our other options? I don't know if there is any other way.
Hold on, we'll get to that. Let's try to nail this down, and then we can get to the charter change discussion.
Well, I wanted to speak to what the state board's requesting on the 19th.
Yeah, exactly.
So the state board is not doesn't know, maybe they do, but I don't think they know about the 4 things that have been enumerated by the Ripton board. They're asking us to kind of essentially come forward and give an update to the board. In the last meeting, they asked Ripton to look at having a conversation with ACSD and considering the options they had, and we expect on the 19th for the state board to move forward. So with some kind of determination, which they've hinted at already. So we are being asked to present to the 2 of us as the delegates of this board to speak to the state board with an update. I don't think they're going to want all the specifics.
They just want
They're just going to want to say, where do things stand? I think it's what they're going to be asking.
So maybe I'm thinking of the audience, if the audience is really that,
Chip?
Yeah, for that, the state board never asked us to sit down and negotiate a new system of governance that will allow Ripton to accept coming back into this district. They never did that. They never used the word negotiate. At least I asked a number of people and couldn't find it ever there. To me, that has a very different connotation than saying you need to talk. I think this statement is fine. I don't know where we go with this. I agree. If Ripton felt that they had another way to change the charter other than getting us as a school board to institute a change, that's their right, I guess, to do that.
Right.
I think that would be foolhardy, since it was voted so solidly when we first voted it. And especially now when we're consolidated with COVID and how well being a unified district has helped us shift people around and deal with all of these sort of changes. That would have been pretty darn hard if you had 7 other school districts. So in any case, I think we should stop talking about this, honestly. We've given this, as you eloquently said, and it's in a general way, but I think I'm done with it, honestly.
Amy?
I just was gonna add that, I mean, I think it states enough of our, of a stand in terms of, we're not talking charter changes. These are things we believe in, and this is where there's room to move forward. So it is enough of an opening for Richmond to come back with, I mean, that's why we asked the question at the last time. Do they have to be charter changes? And the answer was no. So great, to continue a conversation, we can see what other, we're drawing a line, even though it's a very, it's not faint and it's not wishy-washy, it's actually quite clear, but it leaves a lot of room for conversation. So I think it's a really appropriate, and it's really hard to summarize a discussion of 13 people over what was maybe an hour about some really complicated things. So I don't think we can get much more specific because it wouldn't fully represent where we kind of left off as a board. But it does seem like it's broad enough to have some room for some counter proposals if Ripon chooses to do that are not charter changes. I think there's still lots of things that could be discussed, but we haven't gotten there because that's not what they.
Okay, last comment?
Yes, last comment. So I think there's a major disconnect. I mean, I had listened in on the state board discussion. I listened to the audio of it, or the video, and Griffin and what I heard, I walked away with the impression that we were to come together and negotiate, come up with something that would be compromised on our side and probably compromised on their side to be able to come to closure. So in this particular case, we're not doing any of that. We're basically saying the status quo works. So my view was that the board actually charged us to negotiate with them and work with them to come up with, possibly some changes that would enable them to come back into the district. So it could be my misunderstanding, but that's what I heard.
Mary Heather?
Respectfully, I also sat and watched the state board discussion in which the state board recommended that ACSD and Ripon School District come together and talk. I do not believe it was a direction. My impression and my interpretation was that it was not a direction, but rather a caution to the Ripon School District that they were not willing to assign that school district to another supervisory union against another supervisory union's wishes and potentially caused economic disruptions to those supervisory unions, and in our case to our supervisory district, which would then result in a change in our governance structure. And so therefore, either Ripon School District was going to be assigned as their own supervisory union, or they could remain with ACSD. And my understanding was that direction from the state board was to Ripon and ACSD. Does that seem like an alternative that is livable for both of you? Because it sure would be easier if that was the case. I did not interpret it at all as a directive to our district that we must make concessions to allow Ripon to remain. That was my interpretation, and I would encourage every single one of us on the board to watch that meeting and make that determination for yourself.
Okay, we're going to take a vote on this. If there's any other comments. So it would be language as stands. Again, this is for the State Board of Ed. So this is what this is for that audience, so that they have an understanding of where we came down, and we're highlighting the positive that we believe that there is commonality in principle around these two fundamental ideas. We do not believe that we will require a charter. We do not believe that this requires a charter change. Any final comments for those online? Great. All those in, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Clarifying question?
Yes.
So they requested you to be there on the 19th?
Yes.
So we have a few more meetings in between. So if Bridget did come back and say we have some other ideas to discuss, that actually, never mind, because it doesn't change the nature of this statement. And have they asked that to be submitted in advance?
No.
Okay, but you're just taking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, all right, just trying to be clear. Yep, thank you.
Did we, are we voting on it as is or amended with any language to clarify information, data, process, anything like that?
I mean, for those circumstances, in circumstances when it becomes necessary to close or reconfigure any ACSD schools, those circumstances and reasons for closure, including supporting documentation for those reasons, must be clearly articulated and shared with all community
And
members.
did we decide reconfigure was supposed to be?
Repurpose.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that I offer as a friendly amendment, but if we're going to substantively change things, we need to do it in a parliamentary procedure where somebody votes to, moves to amend something.
So, but that would fall under friendly amendment.
Then that seems to be just a.
Great. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. I just want to make sure I get folks online. All those in favor, if you're online, I see Lorraine's hand up. I see Suzanne's hand up. Jen?
I just joined back in after driving home, so I didn't hear the vote. I'll have to abstain.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jen. For those opposed? Barb? Lindsay, did I get you in the?
I'm trying to decide how I vote, actually. I guess I'll vote in favor of this.
Great. And Betty, did I see your hand?
With the
In favor?
change, with the
Okay,
changes.
great, thank you. Just so that Suzanne, because she can't see who's voting aye. And we have Barb voting nay. Great, motion passes. Thank you all very much for that process. Next up, facilities update. So we have had some productive conversations, we, Mary Heather, Peter, myself and Mary with Ben Merrill, who's helping us to write the final report. I think we've really been able to get deep on the outline, and so we have sort of I would say a rough draft. We then went back, as you know, last meeting, we revised the outline. We met with him today, and we've got a plan for moving forward for for getting a rough draft out probably first half of January. So I think the process will be, once that is complete, we'll distribute it to the board and have a conversation and sort of approval of that as a document. And then move into sort of final copy phase. I think that just one of the things we talked about today was something that the board should start to think about, and I think it will in large part fall on the communications committee, but how we want to engage the community around this report, rather than just sort of dropping it in as part of a monthly email or weekly update or whatever. Sort of what do we want to do about it? It could be something like, I know Mary Heather's going to talk next about her communications plan. One of those, one piece of that was having earmarking a portion of certain board meetings to have sort of a give and take question and answer session around important topics. So we could do something like that, where this is
public, and then that following meeting, we open up to question and answer. But just wanted people to sort of start thinking about how they think we should best engage the community once there's complete.
Do you anticipate that the board will get the draft report in advance of the meeting? We would then discuss the draft report at that meeting and vote on it at that meeting? Or do you anticipate it to be a 1-2?
Well, I mean, I think we need clarity around, I don't know that it's an action.
We don't, okay.
I don't know.
I wasn't thinking of it as an action.
I don't think that it's something
There's
that we
nothing
have to.
actionable in it. It's kind of a summary of, I think
We would
getting
make,
getting a draft in front of the board as a whole to review and
make recommendations.
would be
Sure.
helpful.
Okay, great. And so then, but theoretically, then it's really one board meeting worth of work.
That's how
Okay.
I see it.
Okay, great.
Mary Heather, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I can go into some specifics around the sort of communication and engagement follow-up ideas that could be considered, but no, I think, it's in the works and.
Great. Great. Oh, Lindsay.
So you're working on the draft now. What would be the best way to kind of prepare for the content of that? Or I was just looking at, the last meeting was canceled, right? So I'm looking at the 8th of December, just to try to get a sense of what like the outline will look like for the draft. Is how many pages?
So we had the original draft was presented to the board, right? Or was that to the facilities?
The outline?
Yeah, the outline. The outline, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Was presented to the board. I can share the more in-depth outline. Is that what you're?
Yeah, that's
asking for?
essentially what I'm asking. Just,
Yep.
just to have where you're at. I don't really have a sense of where you guys are at, or there was a pivot in the direction, where we're kind of focusing on the present and before we.
Well, I mean, a lot of this report is not necessarily present, but it's historical, sort of how we got here. What's the data that we used, throughout the process? Why did we look at that data? What did we decide because of it? There's a lot of historical perspective in the report as well.
Is it like a 20-page document approximately? Like just how?
It's not done yet.
It's not.
I mean, are we looking at like a 2-page document or a 50-page document? Like,
It'll need a statement.
Yeah, it'll need a statement.
do I need to set aside an entire day to review this? That's basically what I'm asking. If it's like a, 20-page document, I'm gonna need more than like a couple days to review it. It's gonna be like,
I appreciate
I
that.
really don't wanna just get it, talk about it, vote out at the same meeting. Like, I feel like it's way more important and deserves, it would be nice to do it in one meeting, but, I have a feeling there's just gonna be a lot of meat in that.
Yeah.
And within however many pages you give us.
Right.
I think that's a valid point, just in terms of when the board sees it and then schedule
That
the
discussion.
Yeah. That's fair.
Other comments or questions on that? Great, thank you. Mary Heather.
Thank you for your patience and all the content I've sent your way in our board pack. I have three sort of points that I wanted to talk about just in terms of what our committee's been working on. The first one was the question about whether or not to have our private phone numbers on the ACSD board member website. Our committee has, we talked with Sharon in central office and, had explored some other options. It looks like it is possible for us to get a dedicated voicemail for the board. And so what we had talked about as a committee was that we were in support of removing members' private phone numbers from the board and having a dedicated voicemail for our board that the Communications and Engagement Committee would be responsible for and check probably on a weekly basis, much like the Finance Committee goes in and checks the bills. So we would propose that we remove our private numbers from the website and keep our ACSD emails on there, but then have a dedicated board number for any voicemail related questions, and our committee would be responsible for following up on that. And then directing it to the appropriate places. And then what I had suggested to Sharon is, if you remember on our website, we have kind of board member contact info and phone number, and perhaps replacing that phone number column with, maybe when your term ends, because that's something that folks from the community have asked to have displayed on our website as well. So just providing an update with that. I don't know whether we need to vote on that. I would think, it's just something that we can do. So we're working with Sharon on that. So that's item 1. Great. Any questions about that? Perfect. Item 2 is the meat of the material that you were given in your board pack, and I'm hoping, since it was included in last week's material as well, that you've had some time to go through it. But in general, these are kind of our committee's recommendations for kind of just regular communication plan. And we've divided it into sort of internal communications just among our board members, and then external communications to our stakeholders. And these are just kind of, again, summaries of what our committee is just recommending. I think just in terms of internal communications, we want to make sure that folks are using their ACSD email accounts, that you're checking your email accounts regularly so that communications between board members can be prompt and efficient, et cetera, and also kind of in compliance with our open meeting law and things like that. And also setting expectations with respect to group work on Google Doc, making sure that we're always being mindful of setting a quorum or accidentally setting a quorum when we're doing communications internally. So just making sure that we kind of are aware of that. Some of our recommendations with respect to external communications. One of the things we had talked about, and this was something that was kind of discussed as a committee before I came on board, was this idea of adopting a practice of occasionally allowing it like a 10-minute Q&A session in occasional board meetings to allow folks to ask questions about pertinent information as we're considering it as a board. And some examples might be, budget, or, when the facilities master plan report is issued, do we allow the next board meeting to have a little 10-minute session where folks can ask questions about that report and not, have it all at the beginning, where they just put their questions out into the air and don't get a response. So, so that's a consideration that we would propose to the board. We definitely would like to have some kind of system for responding to public comments, and you've known, like in the past month or so, that we've tried adopting that, to try to put it into practice so that you can see what it might look like. But most importantly, so that if people email the board or call the board, that there's not just crickets, that they have some kind of response so that they know their comments have landed safely, that someone is listening, and that the questions, if there are questions, are being directed to the appropriate channels. And the system is the attached document, the supporting document, that I won't go into excruciating detail, but yes. And then the third recommendation would be, our committee feels like it would be good practice to establish just routine sort of updates or newsletters, communications, so that we're providing sort of predictable and regular communications with our stakeholders, so that people are hearing from us whether they need to engage with it or not, and they know what we're up to, and then know what the committees consist of, and know what the committees are working on. so that it's not only when, something controversial or something big is coming up that they're hearing from us. I think it does a lot toward, working toward a workable relationship with our stakeholder community to regularly communicate with them. And so we've divided it into just modes, electronic, paper methods, other considerations in terms of, maybe occasionally having a column in the Attic Indy, that sort of thing, to just try to reach all the people that we're not currently reaching. In terms of frequency, I would personally lean toward quarterly. I sort of feel like monthly would be hard to maintain, but for y'all to consider. And in terms of content, again, updates, upcoming meetings, opportunities for input, any links and references to information that can flesh out what we're working on, and especially like committee updates, just what we're working on. And then finally, the last thing would be community engagement in terms of like, these would be sort of special project engagement, things that we might want to have around a particular issue or a particular topic or project. And I think the idea that we're proposing is that, let's say, for example, Victoria Facilities Committee is wrapping something up and wants to get it out to the community, then it would come to the Communications and Engagement Committee and we would come up with some kind of plan. Here's how we would unroll it. Here's how we would put it out to the community and kind of go from there. So that the Facilities Committee isn't doing all of that work as well. So that's sort of the structure of what we were proposing. The main thing is, I guess, I would like to have some kind of thumbs up, thumbs down from the board about the system for responding to public comments, because that seems to be the thing that comes up the most. And I want to make sure that we're doing it in a professional manner, consistent manner, and in a way that lets folks know that we are listening, and that our responses are sort of generalized enough that we're not committing the board to anything, but also not dry, too dry to make people think that we don't care, because we do very much. So I guess I would just ask for your comments and feedback on this. But before we do that, I do want to let you know that the third thing that our committee was working on was Mary had asked us during one of our full board meetings about taking a look at templates for meeting minutes. Just want to let you know we're working on that. The other things that were included in board pack were things about open meeting law, and those are just sort of best practices reminders. We don't intend to talk about that tonight. We'll save that for another time, but just wanted to let you know that we're working on that and kind of coming up with just a few kind of ideas to kind of establish some best practices for Amy.
Well, and it's probably worth mentioning, and forgive me for sort of cutting in Mary on it, but because at our last meeting, we and I think it was in the context of the facilities communication, we actually acknowledged that the third item of the written proposals around advisory committees was something that we had discussed in the past, and we're going to pick up that conversation. So I think that's pretty significant in light of the engagement. It's a pretty complicated picture, so it's not ready to be shared by any stretch, but it's probably worth everybody knowing.
Yeah, definitely. It's something for sure that I think Jen brought up in our committee meeting that was something that we talked about as a committee, and that Ripton specifically brought up. They would like to see some kind of whatever you call it, kind of an advisory committee or an advisory thing for each community. Kind of thinking about systems and how we can get our information out to the right places in all of our affected towns. Some kind of idea like this might be something worth pursuing. So, that would be an element of the community engagement part. Mary.
I'll just run through a couple questions, comments. Number one is, I worry a little, first of all, thank you, because this is a full load of work. So to everyone, thank you on this. offering a 10-minute component within a school board meeting, I think takes us, I'm worried it's going to create a public meeting in an environment that it's not supposed to be a public meeting, it's supposed to be a meeting of the board that the public can attend. And so I think that's a very important process that we have in place to conduct board meetings in a way that can be effective. And we're now already pushing on 9:15 for the second time in a row. And so I think with those, I think we should think about, as we have done in the past, when we want to tag something, then let's do a town hall and let's create an environment where we can appropriately have the right equipment and the right process and people, et cetera, to attend. I recognize it's another meeting, but I do worry about making that be part of this process. My next comment or question is on the part with regards to email. I think we have to be super careful about any language that says a board member should forward an email that has an inquiry to someone other than the superintendent. Because I don't think the board should be forwarding emails to members of the superintendent's staff, really under any circumstance. And so I think it's important that he or she, the superintendent role, needs to be able to manage his or her team. And so that should go through the superintendent. There was language in, the other comment is that there was language in here in which board members, when board members receive a complaint that they feel the entire board should be made aware of, they should do something. I don't think a board member has that process, like that should go to the, whoever the board chair is at that point, have a discussion with the superintendent and figure out next steps. Otherwise we're gonna have 13 different people are deciding whether or not something like that should occur. So that just might add a little complexity to it. And then the only other thing I would ask is to please look at systems that we currently have in place to get information out, to have input from our community, the friends of organizations that are in all of our elementary schools, really, really lean hard on current stuff because it's so hard to add more to people's plates.
Yeah, and just to that point, Mary, I mean, one of the challenges that we have, I mean, we've thought a lot about like what sort of existing highways exist or can be used to deliver and service conduits out to the community. And part of the problem is that there are not equitable outlets in all of our towns. You know, there's not a Friends of at Bridgeport that is as active as the Friends of at Mary Hogan or the Friends of at Cornwall. Similarly with going through town halls or select boards, the modes of communication in those different towns varies quite a bit, that we're kind of stuck with this question, well, do we use what's there and risk that not everybody's getting the same information, or do we just not use those highways? So I think that's,
and I guess my only comment on that would be to be careful to assume that we could create something that would be just done better because we create it.
Right. No,
You know what I mean? Like, you're still at the end of the day going to be working with people from all different parts of this community.
This was an issue at the beginning of consolidation. Everybody had that issue, was what's going to happen. And some
So just
schools
to
have
think
been
about that,
more
that's
than
all.
others.
The other thing I'll point out was, you know, we've talked a lot about the utility of something like Front Porch Forum that a lot of people are plugged into. And similar thing, the district does not have an account with Front Porch Forums. We would need to ask our board members to, you know, please post this. And, you know, I guess I want the board's feedback on whether or not that could work, recognizing that, you know, you as a board member represent all towns and you know, so to identify, well, here are the Ripton contacts, and you post to Ripton, so I guess I'm just.
Well, Front Porch Forum stuff, you can do ads. So, you know, don't limit ourselves in thinking like if something was important enough that we wanted to get it out there, take an ad out in every Front Porch Forum.
Right.
Pay for it. Right? Like you don't need an account, you don't need to just, if these are the things that are important, let's use resources to get that information out there.
Perfect.
We have somebody online.
Okay.
Suzanne,
Hi, Ari and everyone. So the question I have, which I believe we do not need to legally do, is if from what I understand about minute taking, is I only need to legally record those people who show up at a meeting and speak. I do not need to record email comments that are sent to me or anything to that effect. Because imagine if I get 100 emails saying, oh, I couldn't come and I wanted to say this, I could spend hours retyping or scanning or whatever stuff in. But I believe by statute, I'm only required to record comments that are stated during the public comment and question set or comment period, and that's it, not the emails that come to me or to the board.
Really legally required to do
Yeah.
that much.
Yeah, correct.
Chip?
I don't know whether you or I will.
Go first.
Okay. Commenting on your 10-minute thing at board meetings, I would be very much against that. This is a working group, okay? And we cannot have constant discussions. As we've heard from public comments over the last few meetings, not this one so much, but some of them were all over the place. So I'm not necessarily pertinent to what we're talking about right at the moment. So I think it's not a hearing. It's just not a hearing. We have hearings. We have questions at the annual meeting. We have other times, and if we felt that was necessary, we can, I guess, find the time with special meetings. But I agree totally with Mary. I would not favor that at all. I just don't think it adds to us. We've learned a lot in the whole building, in the facilities master plan development, with how people participated in those kinds of things and how at times it was pretty unbalanced relative to who we heard from and how we heard from people. So that's my opinion on that.
Yeah. So thank you for all the hard work that you've done on this. There's a lot of work here. A couple things. Possibly, since we all live in different communities, I realize that we all are, supporting the whole district. But if there were some flexibility, not everybody comes from Portsmouth. I mean, you still have that gap. But in each individual town, there may be a preferred way. And I would be happy if I think that was possible. For example, we have our counselor sends out an email. It's pretty expensive, to send information out. Some other towns may have a better method, another method that they would use that would get the information to the most number of people. So maybe it's not one size fits all, but as someone living in that town, I could help decide what would be a best practice for tomorrow. Others could decide like Maryville, Middlebury, Salisbury, whatever. And I think regarding like being able to address questions, that kind of thing, possibly if we could come up with instead of maybe the newsletter, we have a Zoom session that's a Q&A where we have, topics that we're going to discuss. And not maybe spend as much time in creating another work item, but then have the ability for people to participate via Zoom and ask questions on certain topics that we've been dealing with, but it's a schedule. And so people know ahead of time that we're going to be doing that.
I really like that idea. I think the challenge is none of us are authorized to speak on behalf of the board.
I know. So it would have to be something that as the board would decide to do.
Yeah, okay. Lindsay, and then that's,
I think you had your hand.
oh, sorry.
Okay. I just wanted to mention, so in the meetings, we definitely have, I don't know, I guess identified the current pathways, and we very much want to stick with those and not create more work. But one of the things that has been a theme is kind of realizing who we're missing out on and any new pathway that the committee is actively considering, the goal is to engage people who aren't already connected with the board. That's kind of the impression that I have, is that we're not trying to, so even something like using the school-based, parent, family teacher organizations, that would be an area where we're actually getting a lot of information to the schools, but that's where we start talking about like the Addison Independent, what's the cost of taking out an ad, and how do we reach new language learners? How do we, we see the same, 20 faces at the meetings. What about the other 1,000 people? And what about the rest of the people in our community who are grandparents or considering starting a family in Addison County? So, and it's a really big group of constituents that we're trying to engage. So, and in some cases it's been tried before and it just hasn't worked out, but in some places we just haven't really, I don't know if there has been an attempt. It's just kind of like, oh yeah. So, yeah, we don't, but that's kind of, the capacity is something that it just keeps coming up. We can just have Mary Heather devote like 40 hours a week to answering the phone and the emails and doing like new videos, e-chats. I think you'd be really good at it, but I don't think you have 40 hours a week to do that. But we have all these great ideas, but capacity is constantly, so, I don't know if we can engage district volunteers, but,
Yeah, we talked about, certainly there's quite a percentage of our community that, are already plugged into ACSD. So using those existing channels is not really helping us reach beyond. So that's why we were thinking like Gabby Indy, or maybe there's a way for us to, plug into some of the, I don't know, like the Lions Club or, these other organizations within the community that are active in the community that can just help us get the work that we're doing out so that folks are aware of what we're doing. Betty?
Yeah, thank you, Mary Heather, for putting this together. I was going to comment on the Q&A session. I understand it's not our common practice to do that at board meetings, but I also feel like looking back at the retreat that we had, I believe it was early, I can't remember, but we had a lady present, talk to the board about, setting goals and how, we want to move forward as a board. And one of the things she mentioned is, creating new ways of functioning, or, just, thinking outside the box, so to speak. But this would be like a new way of, engaging, allowing the public to engaging with the public. And it wouldn't be at every board meeting, but just maybe like once a month, maybe at a board meeting where we don't have a super packed, agenda. But and it would be timed, so we would be strict on the time and say, okay, this should not go beyond 10 minutes. And but I feel like it would encourage more, public participation, and as a way for us to get to hear, invite more public participation.
Well, I think one of the reasons that it was being discussed at our committee level was because it had been tried with some success at a prior
budget
board meeting. I guess it was before I was on the board, but I had heard, we had discussed that that it was positively received.
Yeah.
And certainly, is an opportunity for folks when we're talking about really important topics. It's just another way for folks to be more informed. So something to think about.
I mean, I think we've always done it around the budget, but that's sort of a distinct meeting. I think what you're referring to is we had the town hall at the beginning of the pandemic, which was a separately
So it's not-
advertised
yeah, it's not-
meeting, and it was great.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of back and forth, but it was well moderated, and I thought very informative, but it was
Not-
separate, yeah. Perfect.
I'm just gonna say, this is a topic that has been discussed by every school board everywhere since time began. And it's very, very hard to move the needle. But I appreciate, I think we can all throw our suggestions at Mary Heather and hope for the best. But definitely thinking about capacity. We've got 2 more meetings a month. We've got committee meetings. We've got people who serve on other boards like the Henderson Career Center. And it's hard. I mean, it's just hard. We're a governing board. And the fact is that a lot of the people, or a lot of the issues that people have with the school is sort of operational and not necessarily governance. And, so that's why I'm a big believer that if you're going to engage with the public, that you engage on a specific topic that is relevant to what the board is doing.
I guess, I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to get from this is whether or not y'all feel, or how we should handle emails and the process that we've sort of experimented. How is that going? Because I don't want to just assume like, oh, well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing if y'all don't feel okay with that. But yeah, here.
So, when I was chair, I think the system was basically designating one person to respond to emails. And emails aren't that dissimilar to public comment. We don't respond to public comment either. It's there for us to hear and not necessarily debate somebody on. I think people want to. So I think that, respectfully responding to email, somebody designated, usually the chair, that says, we received it, we shared it. Thank you very much. Going beyond that, you get an equity issue where people who come to the meeting don't get a response, but hey, if you email, you might be able to engage differently. It's a tough needle to thread, really.
I think it's just acknowledging it. There are other situations where you personally get an email that really is directed at the board, that came about a specific topic, whether it's charter change or anything else. And it's appropriate that the entire board get it because it really was addressed to the board.
Right.
Then, in fact, I think you can forward something like that to the board. Not everything.
I think that Mary Heather's done a great job responding to the different emails coming. It's respectful to say, we got it, and this will be, the board knows about it, and thank you for, it's welcoming. I think if somebody just sends out an email and then they don't get anything back, it's like, well, did it go anywhere? Did they see it? So I think what you've done is very helpful, and you're not giving out, like, this is what we're gonna do. We received it, thank you, and so I think that's a very appropriate.
So question then for you on that, because I think, does everybody feel comfortable getting copied on those responses so that you know?
Yeah, you should just CC everyone.
Okay.
But I agree with the couple of comments. It should really be about receipt.
Yep, receipt.
And that we
not trying to solve.
Not trying to solve it, not trying to, we've received it.
Totally agree, yeah.
And I would just suggest that if this becomes a big thing, that we group letters and say, here are the letters received this week.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can get lost in the email morass.
Good point.
Great. Anything else, Matt?
I don't think so. This is great. Appreciate the feedback.
And again, thank you to the entire committee. I know this is a lot of folks
Yeah,
who
this is
spent a lot
great.
of time. Really, thank you.
There. The agenda, we missed one thing.
Chip,
I think you missed something on the agenda.
I'm sure I did because.
Actually,
Peter, it was subconscious. Peter informed me that the lawyers are still negotiating some items, so we're not discussing.
So we put it there thinking we would have it. So.
Apologies.
All I wanted to make sure is.
I thank you.
Didn't get an email.
Exactly.
Saying we have to sign this.
No, we're good.
The same
I
question.
appreciate that. It's just subconscious on my part. Great, so thank you. You're good then, Mary Heather? I am, thank you. Perfect. Then I think there's nothing in other from a logistical perspective. We are trying to take a very quick photo at the end of this meeting, which will be incredibly quick.
Reindeer.
So when the meeting does end, if we could just get everybody outside in the hallway, in the foyer, kind of as we're leaving, the main foyer, we'll take it right there. Lindsay.
I have another, not for any action today, but I would be interested in learning more from our representatives on the Hannaford Career Center Board. I'm just realizing that I don't know as much as I should about that, and I would really like to know more about, how they interact with our budget, ESSER funds, that. I'm getting bits and pieces of it. So, but we have so much else going on. Would it be realistic to have a little bit more information about that?
We'll figure out a way to get that information if it's not a full agenda item, but we might be able, we'll figure out a solution for that, absolutely.
Yeah, if there's staff coming up that we have to in some way evaluate or.
Yeah, we can totally provide some.
I know how much I don't know, but I don't know what I don't.
My list is long.
We're all in that boat.
Yeah, Mary?
I'm basically sort of thinking about the same thing, the comments that were made about the Career Center at our last board meeting are concerning. And since we have board members on that committee, I'd really like more information.
Okay.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. Okay, next up, motion to adjourn. That's great. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much. Photo in the hallway. Don't try.